How did it all begin? The galaxy which spawned endless stories of good versus evil, clashing on both small and large scales. It has been a source of infinite inspiration and countless untold histories. We've all become accustomed to the ships blasting off through hyperspace, the wondrous technology which enables the creation of blasters, and the noble lightsaber. We've seen how the Republic reigned supreme, and even how it fell. Each and every planet in the lore is rich with its own story and history that has been passed down for generations. Almost everywhere you look, you see ruins of ancient civilizations, people marveling at technology which seems to have been there for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet still works perfectly. But of course, the beings who lived in these places and built those wonders are but whispers of the distant past, echoes, dust. Star Wars is filled with conversations about the ones who came before, and it is suggested that there was a time in history, long before the Republic was ever formed, where the galaxy was very much a different place than we know it as today. But where did it all come from? Where did it all begin? Why does the Force move throughout every living being, connecting them to the cosmos? Why do we hear so much about the Celestials, yet know so little about them? Our hearts and minds within these archives have burned with these very questions, and perhaps it is time that we finally uncover the truth. My friends, if you're joining us today, then you've stumbled upon a very special holocron, perhaps one of the most important ones that we've ever created. In the archives today, we are going to be exploring the ancient past and history of the galaxy, beginning with its very creation and ending only when the Republic is formed. So welcome, we've been expecting you. This was a process that took the combined effort of every member of our team, and after much work and research, we've compiled a thorough timeline of the ancient prehistory of the Star Wars galaxy. Now, of course, because this history is so incredibly vast, with each and every planet having its own story and development, there are going to be some things that may slip through the cracks of this already very long and thorough video. So if you notice something that wasn't talked about, please be sure to comment down below so that we can dedicate a special holocron to it. And that goes for anything else during the documentary that you find interesting as well and would like to see further expounded upon. Before we officially enter, we want to give a major disclaimer. In an effort to paint the greatest picture on the most widely acceptable version of the primordial Star Wars galaxy, we have chosen to use Supernatural Encounters as a firm source. For those of you who may not know, this book, Supernatural Encounters, is a controversial work whose continuity in Legends is currently disputed. It is a book which attempts to paint the story of how the Star Wars universe came into being, to flesh out the full story of the Celestials and the ancient galaxy, and link together all the strange and unusual parts of Legends lore and continuity. The position of the book's continuity is disputed because its author originally had the licensing go-ahead to develop stories for Lucasfilm. However, with the change in Lucasfilm ownership coming at the abrupt discontinuation of the website before Supernatural Encounters could be fully completed. Although the author had already signed a licensing deal from Lucasfilm and even had tax forms, so he approached Lucasfilm about having his work still be published on a website under Legends continuity. Lucasfilm actually agreed and approved of his manuscripts so long as he published it under the disclaimer that it was in accordance with Legends. However, despite having the proper paperwork, by the time that he presented the complete version of Supernatural Encounters, Lucasfilm had been officially issued to decree that not only Legends continuity was no longer a part of the main story, and that Lucasfilm didn't want anything to do with Legends at all besides the few comics that were still in production. Though the author of Supernatural Encounters was given the green light to release the book non-commercially. It is because of this strange limbo and complex legality that Supernatural Encounters finds itself in what we at the archives have been calling pseudo-canon, meaning that we will still use its concepts to explain the history of the primordial galaxy, since they were technically approved by Lucasfilm for Legends. However, some concepts, albeit very few, do run contrary to George Lucas's vision as previously established Legends work, but we will point them out. When these continuities errors arise, we will be defaulting to what has been established prior to Supernatural Encounters and will be sticking exclusively to what George Lucas has stated as a part of Legends continuity. In other words, we're going to use Supernatural Encounters, but George's vision trumps all. By the end, we of course want you to decide for yourselves if you believe Supernatural Encounters should be considered a part of Legends. And by its legality, it technically is, but it has been yet to be accepted by the wider fan base. In the end, this video is not meant to be a voucher in favor or against the continuity of Supernatural Encounters, but rather a full documentary with the goal of telling the most complete story possible for the galaxy's earliest days. To keep it all simple, we will use the Galactic Standard Calendar, which is before the Battle of Yavin, or BBY. And now, my friends, without further ado, make sure you're comfortable, you have a glass of blue milk, and prepare your minds, as we are about to present the long-lost period of the pre-Republic history, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Part 1. The Dawn of Time. The first thing to know about the Star Wars Expanded Universe is that it has many universes. There is the Prime Universe, several secondary universes. Very little is actually explained within Supernatural Encounters on what these universes are. This is due to the main story of Star Wars Legends taking place within one of the secondary universes. But to get there, we have to begin with the first, the Prime Universe, where all things spawned in Star Wars. In the beginning, there was a being known as the Supreme Maker, an entity that we have very little information about, except that he goes by many names: the Father of Light, the Father of Spirits, or the Prime Shaper. In the beginning of it all, the Supreme Maker let out a great light, one that moved through the phantasmal mists of the endless void of nothingness. This light let out a single sound, a beautiful note that would never be heard again in all of existence. From this light and song note, stars came into being across the primary universe. These stars then began to take strange geometric shapes, and they became polygons of pure light and energy. These polygons awoke and became sentient beings known to us as the Celestials. In the very first stretch of their lives, they simply danced joyfully to the Song of the Eternal, relishing in all of creation. The Supreme Maker then spilled forth a cheerful, a radiant energy into the vastness of space. A power like none other, to move, to shape, to grow. This power was the Force, an energy to sow, to harvest life by the will of the Supreme Maker, who is its eternal Lord. The Force permeated through all life, and then time itself began to flow, and existence began in the Star Wars universe. More sounds rang forth for a second, and a third time, and the song continued, even more beautiful than before. And from this sound came into the physical being matter, which began with the plane of Eretz, and so that all life would always have a connection to its maker and each other. Midichlorians were then created, microscopic organisms that were the gateway between the cosmic and the living force, and within these midichlorians lived the Wills, sentient beings which listened to the voice of the Maker, acted as its will, becoming the will of the Force itself. And because of that, life began to teem on Eretz, the plane of their existence. In Eretz, the Celestials were then gathered before the light of the Maker, as the Maker endowed upon them the understanding of the 4 precepts: love, justice, power, and finally, wisdom. With an inexorable power of the Force, the Supreme Maker tasked the Celestials with a job. They were to learn all about the universe, so that one day they could help construct and to bring it into being. In doing this, they were also free to roam the universe, to frolic amongst the vast expanse of space, doing mostly as they pleased. Many among the Celestials descended to the plane of Eretz, and there they reshaped themselves into forms that harmonized with living creatures that were developing and growing there. Eretz was a gorgeous planet, one that contained every element of existence. It has been described as intoxicatingly beautiful, a place that every Celestial fell in love with. What the Celestials referred to as tiny movers upon the plane of Eretz were its native inhabitants, the oldest species in the universe of Star Wars. These would one day become known as humans, and for a great long time, the Celestials and the humans lived in peace, until it all came to a sudden and a disheartening end. Among the song of light and joy, notes of discord entered with those of the Celestial race and the coveted Eretz. The thoughts of domination, a lust for power began to spread in their minds as they became fallen stars, eclipsed by darkness. The first of them to fall went by the name of Nakash, who became known as the Father of Shadows. He led his fallen brothers and sisters into a conquest. Utilizing powers granted them through the Force, they attempted to seize possession of Eretz for themselves, corrupting the nature of the life-giving energy of the Force, giving birth to the dark side. This began the first of the cosmic wars between the Celestials upon Eretz. This heavily influenced the humans living there, as they came to understand the meaning of war and domination, and the first humans were ruined by it. Monstrous offspring appeared as a result of this corruption and the introduction of the dark side, as the Father of Shadows and his followers caused the dark side to permeate through all living beings. The Celestials did all they could to provide protection and aid to the innocent, all the while deeply mourning the ruin of their beautiful world. At long last, a splinter group of 7 Celestials left Eretz to create their own place, a place separate from the corruption of the dark side. These 7 were named Luxos, Marutz, Zerz, Elegast, Ifa, Nifal, and Wutzek. In their appearance, they are described as glowing clusters of orbs made of pure energy. Unfortunately, they were cautioned that no matter what dimension they would be in, that evil would find its way there eventually. But with this in mind, they went forward with shaping their own worlds, while they waited for the war to end. The Celestials would create a dimension known as the World Between Worlds. This was basically to serve as an observation deck between time and space, a place where they could observe any event in history, past, present, or future, and even travel between spaces within those times. Eventually, the war with the Father of Shadows would come to an end, and a new universe was spawned into being. A second universe which was connected and derived from the Prime Universe. In this new age, many realms were constructed by the Celestials, but the main realm, which would contain the galaxy that we know it, is known as the Sky River Universe. The Sky River is actually the closest name we have to the main galaxy, though the only ones that would continue to call it that into the modern age would be the Nagai species, who lived in the dwarf satellite galaxy known as the Fire Fist. The Fire Fist orbited around the unknown regions, but that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Now let's go back to the World Between Worlds. From the World Between Worlds, the Celestials shaped the Sky River galaxy and began their Age of Rule, a mysterious age heretofore that has been completely shrouded in mystery. And so begins our next chapter of our story. Part 2, The Reign of the Celestials. Chapter 1, The Firstborn. Luxos was the chief among the 4 Celestials involved in the creation of the Sky River galaxy, and from him, all of them began to shape the flora and fauna of the galaxy, inspired by the creation of their homeworld on Eret, bringing into being creatures that were of aquatic, land-dwelling, and avian, along with those that could even dwell in space itself. Using the Force's power, the Celestials would create 80 total kinds of beings, which became known as the Firstborn species of the galaxy, or just the Firstborn. From what we understand, the Celestials did not make every species in the galaxy the same, as some species were later spurred upon into evolution because of the Force, but it were these Firstborn species who were those that walked among the stars in the very beginning. Very rough estimations by scientists in lore place the age of the Firstborn as having been sometime in the range of 5 million to 2 million BBY. In-universe, the author of Supernatural Encounters is Arul Hexaphone, and he believed these dates to be an erroneously, grossly overestimated claim. Unfortunately, he does not provide a numerical alternative, so 2 to 1 million BBY is what we'll say for the purposes of this video, since that's around the time many scientists in Star Wars believe a lot of these ancient races actually vanished. The Firstborn consisted of many races, which has been told to us in legends, but have developed now into myth. Each of them were adorned with the power of the Force, and had the innate ability to command the Force in extremely powerful ways. This ranged from the power to create organic life, to moving and shaping matter with their hands and their minds, and even the ability to create entire worlds and civilizations, commanding the elements themselves. Each of the Firstborn species were designed to be both graceful and powerful. The Firstborn were intended to one day take the place of the Celestials. The 7 Celestials were not meant to remain in the galaxy and rule over the Sky River forever. They were destined for tasks unknown, creating other realms. And so they would instill into the Firstborn the importance of the 4 precepts: love, justice, power, and wisdom. According to legend, the races of the Firstborn were all immortal, immune from harm so long as they held fast to the 4 precepts, obeyed the ways of the Celestials. Of the first 80 Firstborn we know of, we only have real information on about 30 of them. As we briefly talk about each of them, keep in mind that most of these species are considered as ancient ones in the lore, and in the modern galaxy, most of what we know of them are only relegated to legend, myth, and what has been left behind. The first of the Firstborn that we want to discuss today is known as the Dween Uoguin, better remembered as the Star Dragons. The Dween Uoguin were a race of massive, but peace-loving dragons that could fly through the vacuum of space. The average length was around 10 meters, but could sometimes be up to 100 meters long or more. The dragons had segmented bodies, large wings which aided in their flight. Some of them could even breathe fire, exhaling superheated gases. They were described as 20 times more powerful than the average turbo laser battery. Like almost all of the firstborn species, the star dragons were extremely long-lived, having lifespans of around 6,000 years. They also had a reputation for being very wise, calm, and even-tempered. They preoccupied their minds with cosmic musings, making them even more mysterious. Even until the modern age of the galaxy, the species maintained a strong, innate sense of morality, likely stemming from being instilled in them with the original 4 precepts of the Celestials. Later in the future, a handful of star dragons would even become Jedi, and one was unfortunately killed by Grievous during the Clone Wars. The second species is the Gree. The Gree were a species of cephalopods with many tentacles that inhabited a planet of the same name, Gree. The Gree were considered to be among the most intelligent, the most advanced of the firstborn, and possibly the first to begin their own empire in Star Wars. The Gree's greatest contribution to the galaxy was the creation of the Hypergates, portals that allowed the firstborn to travel onto any world of their choosing for the purpose of communion with one another. The Gree also helped in establishing the trading of goods and diplomacy. The invention of hyperspace gates led to a wide sense of community and interdependence within the galaxy. The third species was the Quoth, also known as the Qua. The Quoth are the ancestor race of the Qua, who were the first natives to the world of Dathomir. They were a blue reptilian species which were best known for discovering technology of the Infinity Gates. They were quite similar to the Hypergates. In this, they allowed instantaneous travel to certain points of the galaxy, but the technological philosophy behind them was a little bit different. The Qua constructed pyramidal star temples which housed 3 Infinity Gates and star chambers. This allowed them to actually spread their influence and to build a small empire. However, much later in history, a conflict would erupt between the Gree and the Qua over the Hypergates and the Infinity Gates, but we will cover that a little bit later. For now, let's move on to the fourth species, the Diathym. The Diathym were a race of powerful winged sentients that inhabited the planet of Lego and its moon, Milius Prime. It was their beauty that made them so famous among the spacefarers of the galaxy, who began to refer to the Diathym as angels. Their appearance would actually vary depending on who was looking at them, taking the shape of whatever the beholder found most beautiful in their own species' eyes. Legends of these angels would even reach the ears of a young Anakin Skywalker on Tatooine. The Diathym didn't seem to have any physical form, but were blazing white and yellow lights in a feminine humanoid shape with 6 wings protruding from their back. They radiated an aura of kindness and were benevolent to all who encountered them. Unfortunately though, despite how kind and beautiful they were, they had innate hypnotic abilities and were fascinated by spacecraft. This caused them to swarm any ships that came too close to their world or their moon. Their beauty would mesmerize the pilots, often causing them to lose control of their ships and to crash. Because of this tendency to cause accidents, the Diathym were still widely regarded as dangerous beings in the galaxy. The next species that we want to talk about is known as the Neti. The Neti were a race of plant people who were made of roots and vegetation. They were extremely long-lived like the star dragons, their lifespan reaching well over 4,000 years so long as they had a steady supply of sunlight and water. Their skin was bark-like, and they had the ability to transform themselves from looking very humanoid to looking like regular trees. In the case of a lack of proper nourishment from photosynthesis, they could enter a hibernation trance that could last several hundreds to even thousands of years if necessary. The next species is the Killiks. The Killiks were a hive-minded insectoid race with telepathic abilities and a knack for construction. The Killik were native to the world of Alderaan, but were found almost anywhere in the galaxy that the Celestials needed them. Because of their efficiency in construction, the Celestials often exploited them to work on massive building projects, which we'll describe later in this holocron, but the Killiks are very important. The next of the firstborn is known as the Pelgrin. We know almost nothing about the Pelgrin species other than they may have been the first to delve deeply into the complexities and studies of the Force. A lot of what we know about the Pelgrin is left behind due to their oracle. It is recorded by the Oracle that they had become geniuses with steam-powered and mechanical technology, and although they were primitive, they had the uncanny ability to replicate any advanced technology that they interacted with, but to make it with different mechanisms, such as using steam rather than electricity. Archaeologists have found evidence of steam-powered vehicles, mechanical communication systems, and even more. The most impressive of these came to be known as the Oracle. Using their intellect and religious ways, the Pelgrins constructed a mysterious tower which was extremely powerful in the Force. It stood 10 stories tall, and was made of the Dio tree, and wood, and metal. At the very top there was a hexagonal prism, which pointed directly towards the sky. It was a rather unremarkable tower on the outside, lacking any sort of markings or symbols that would give any information about what it was whatsoever. but in the inside, it was filled to the brim with sophisticated gears, cogs, and clockwork circuits. No one quite knows how it actually works, as there are no switches or levers to turn it on or off. The Oracle was known to grant intense and vivid visions of the future to any Force sensitive that meditated within the tower. There is much more to be said about the Oracle of Pelgren, but we must move on to the other races of the Firstborn first. The next of the species is known as the Cathol. The Cathol were native to the planet of the same name in the Outer Rim. They would later become known as the Precursors and the Old Ones. They were a highly advanced society in comparison to the more primitive ones that they shared the Firstborn with. In the Cathol lifetime, they would possess organic technology not unlike that of the Yuzhong Vong, and would use it to grow biological machines, which resulted in the creation of 3 slave races. These races were known as the Charonti, which were a race of arachnid farmers. The Mao, a dangerous, amorphous species of Force-sensitive ooze, which consume prey by entering them through facial orifices and eating them from the inside out. And the third slave race were known as the Darkstriders, which were a gigantic centipede-like supercomputer that would later serve as the guardian of the Cathol's life well. But one of the most impressive creations of theirs was an object known as the Codex. This was a small pyramid with a metallic surface, very reminiscent of a Sith holocron, though as far as we know, it contained no internal knowledge. It served a different purpose, to locate and to quantify the Force itself. It could also enhance the Force sensitivity of whoever possessed it as well. But next, we must move on to the next race, the Alashan. The Alashan are only known by leaving behind the vast underground city, which they called the Forever. The Alashan thrived within the Forever, guarding it with organic creatures of their own making that they called the Sentinels. The Sentinels were large creatures that gave off an immense amount of energy. It had a supernatural strength to them, as well as the city, as well as the ability of the Sentinels to change their size and even teleport. The Sentinels' only purpose was to protect the vast underground complex of the Forever. The Sentinel creature would remain alive all the way until the Galactic Civil War era, far outliving the people that it was created to serve, and never wavering from its sole purpose. The next species is known as the Ahra Nafi, the ancestors of the Kella. Not much is known about the Nafi, other than they would later evolve, or just become what is known as the Konet, who in turn would become the Kella. They were native to their planet of Broth Kella in the Outer Rim. The species of the Nephi were originally tall, lanky quadrupeds who had stubby 3-fingered hands with double-jointed limbs. In terms of advancements, their technology again was much like the Yuzhong Vong and the Cathol. They used bioengineering for all of their machines, but it is believed that they were originally an aquatic species. Moving on, we have the Kalai. By the time of the modern galaxy, the Kalai are an extremely mysterious species that has an unknown biology makeup. Only rumors ever persist about them, with claims ranging from them being avians to humanoid, or even sentient balls of light. But it is more than likely the first option. This is because the Kalai themselves haven't really been seen in the wider galaxy. They have been known to mate with humans and reproduce a crossbreeded species though, known as the Lethago, with the Lethago looking more bird-like and avian. The Lethago often spoke and acted on behalf of their mysterious parents in public. When asked directly about their parent species, the Kalai, the Lethago would only ever respond that the Kalai were observers, content with watching the continuing struggle between the residents of the stars, never wanting to get directly involved. At least that's what's going on in their modern age of the galaxy. It isn't known what they did, or where they lived during this ancient period though. All we know is that they exist. The 13th species is known as the Lucent. The Lucent was a species of sentient crystalline arachnids that hail from a world that was thought to be hidden somewhere in the Voidfire Nebula. This was located in the Expansion region. The Lucent was a name given to them much later in the modern timeline though, as the name for their people in their language is unpronounceable to humans. Despite their frightening spider-like appearance though, they were quite friendly, trustworthy, and insatiably curious about all other races and technologies. The Lucent species had a unique perception of the Force. They called it the Life Web. While it was rare for one of them to be Force sensitive enough to harness and actually touch the Force to any extent, all of the Lucents were able to see the Force as a web of shining crystal strands connecting everything together. Because of this, they were excellent navigators and could do mental calculations to find the fastest and the safest routes through hyperspace, and they could even do this without navicomputers or droids. The 14th species is known as the Ang-Ti. Best known as the Ang-Ti because of the Ang-Ti months. They were mammalian, with long bodies, standing on 2 feet, and having a long tail with plated skin. as well as 6 long tongues that extended in order to speak to other beings telepathically. The species themselves were incapable of producing any real sound. The Ang-Ti were powerfully force-sensitive though, and chose not to view the force in terms of light and dark, but in the form of many colors. Because of this, they developed many strange and esoteric abilities, such as the fold space technique, an ability which allowed the user to essentially fold 2 points in space using the force, causing perfect teleportation to occur. However, they don't use this very often, believing that it has been a gift for their deities, which it was. They remember being endowed with the gift from the Celestials, and so they saw the Force as sacred, something that was not to be meddled with. The 15th species is known as the Sephi. The Sephi were an elf-like humanoid race natives to the world of Thrusta. They were quite long-lived, though usually only a couple of hundred of years in comparison to the thousands of years of the other firstborn species. In the future, their people would go on to be friends with the Jedi Order, and they had a close relationship for thousands of years. The 16th is known as the Oswath. These were a strange species of transparent, manta ray-like creatures that actually did not have a home planet but lived in deep space. The Oswath lived inside of the Thobaka Nebula, and much like the Purrgil, they swarmed through space as if it were an ocean, and traveled through hyperspace at will. They were fiercely intelligent species, as their brains took up almost 2/3 of their entire biomass. They were so intelligent, in fact, that they first found tasks like cracking Imperial communication codes to be trivial. The 17th species is known as the Katuman. The Katuman were a humanoid race of felines, with their home planet remaining unknown. They were said, though, to be the greatest hunters in the entire galaxy, making them apparently even better than Trandoshans. It's possible that they are a distant relative or even an ancestor of the Cathar species. The 18th is known as the Zaxax. This species went extinct before any records could be made of them, unfortunately, though, and so the only thing we know is that they were a technologically advanced race. They created many strange and powerful devices that were left scattered among the unknown regions. One of these would be an entire artificial planet, which was something of a factory that produced many strange bits of technology. The Zaxax were also known to have created cures for deadly illnesses and diseases, a hidden space station as well, and the first communication systems that allowed their fellow firstborns to communicate with one another across the galaxy. Although the species went extinct, it's clear that they were important. The 19th is the species known as the Elayan. The Elayan were the original inhabitants of Polis Massa, before the world was subjugated to a cataclysm that left it barren and a cluster of asteroids. One of the only things left behind by them was the underground city of the Wiantah, the ruins of which somehow survived this cataclysm. It is very possible that the Kalidahim were the descendants of the Elayan. But so far, these claims have remained unsubstantiated, and it's possible that the species went extinct. At 20, we have the Kuru. We know little about the actual race of the Kuru before the cult known as the Fellowship of the Kuru began. Either the species, or a man who called himself Kuru, would produce a scroll known as the Teachings of Kuru, which began a brand new religion. The Kuru and their fellowship would build strange shrines throughout the unknown regions and the Outer Rim. Later experts didn't know why the Kuru built these shrines, but they would later be used as archaic teleporters during a massive war. At 21, we have the Krivaiki. This species was native to Krivas, and they were a crustacean species. You may recognize one of the species by Master Vodo Siosk Boss, a powerful Jedi Master who was Exar Kun's Jedi Master originally. The species had many tentacles underneath their clothes, which they used as arms and legs. They cared little about technological advancement or personal appearance, but focused a lot on their own spiritual experience, avoiding conflict whenever they could, promoting non-violence. Which is also why Master Boss refused to use a lightsaber, only a force-imbued staff as a weapon. At the 22nd of the firstborn species, we have the Kamasi. Of the Kamasi, it was said that around the galaxy one couldn't find a friendlier being. They were a furry race with a fleshy snout and pointed ears. While they did have fangs and claws, it was extremely rare that they would ever actually use them, or even have them be seen. They were a pacifist people, with a culture heavily revolving around the tenets of the 4 precepts. They were so compassionate, in fact, that one of the words Kamasi came from meaning friend from afar, or stranger to be trusted, and many other languages that would form. They produced some of the finest diplomats in the entire galaxy, which allowed them to mediate otherwise deadly disagreements. Apparently, when the creation of the Jedi Code occurred, the Order drew heavy inspiration from this race. We can attribute a lot of their peace-loving nature to their strange telepathic powers. They could share memories, which they called the Memni. A Memni was as vivid to the receiver as it was to the individual that experienced it originally. Considering the fact that a memory of killing or harming another being would be extremely troubling and even unbearable, the race sought to avoid such measures unless absolutely necessary. They valued peace and serenity above all. At 23, we have the species known as the Cinnitine. The Cinnitine were humanoids with extremely large brains. In fact, their heads resembled brains. Cinnitine's brains possessed hyperintelligence to the point of being able to calculate a hyperspace jump without the aid of a computer of any kind. But unfortunately, that's pretty much all we know. At 24, we had the Mu'ab. The Mu'ab were a star-shaped species that had been divided into a peaceful, coexisting groups, two separate factions. You had the storytellers, called the Usandun, and the crafters, known as the Oris. The storytellers crafted grand works of poetry, an epic verse that spread across the galaxy. The Oris were the craftsmen of their cities and their technology, which they put their talents together. It was said that nothing could not be accomplished. Together they fashioned the earliest droids based on a celestial design provided to them. They created the first droids as personal aides, fellow workers, and even companions for their children. The second of their living creatures was the more advanced, the Celatanium, which were droids that resembled the Mu'ab and could artificially reproduce. They were called the Dream Children, powerful, elegant, and wise. The 25th species is one that many fans will be familiar with, the Ithorians. The Ithorians are still prevalent in the modern age of the galaxy. These hammer-headed aliens were known for having 2 mouths and 4 throats, giving them powerful voices and the ability to speak in stereo. Ithorians were naturally attuned to the light side of the Force and worshipped their life-giving jungle on the planet of Ithor. They considered their jungle to be so sacred, in fact, that very few people allowed them to touch the surface of Ithor or build anything on it. In their grand city, this is where their species lived in harmony. Their city resembled a giant floating disc that was kept in constant propulsion and motion by the grand repulsor lifts. Even their city was not allowed to touch the sacred ground of Ithor. The next species, the Tong. The Tong were humanoid simians that originated from the planet of Notron, which would later become known as Coruscant. Unfortunately, we know very little about their culture before they became the warriors that became the Mandalorians. We do, however, know that they were a tribalistic and nomadic people. They appreciated nature in its purest form and preferred not to construct large cities in an effort to respect their natural environment. The 27th species is the Dur Saban. Very little is known about the Saban, but they appear to be very large sentient serpents, native to aquatic environments. They had flesh-like heads and fins along with 2 arms and webbed hands. They were native to a largely aquatic planet of the same name in the Outer Rim. The 28th species is known as the Sonesi, an amphibious species native to the world of Monar II, with a strange life cycle to their name. Apparently, they entered the world as hairy, mindless creatures until they reached the age of 15, where they entered a deep hibernation. During this, their sweat forms a cocoon around them, and they develop into an intelligent Sunsea species. They awaken and are forced to fight their way out of their cocoons. Should they survive, they emerge as an amphibian with beautiful turquoise skin. Their society was deeply spiritual and was one of the only monotheistic religions in the galaxy that still worshipped the Maker in his original form. The 29th is known as the Selegians. The very strange people were a species that appears to be floating brains with jellyfish-like appendages. They had a natural form of telekinesis that did not require the Force. This allowed them to float around and move things at whim. They were native to the world of Selegia, whose atmosphere was comprised with cyogen, a gas that was toxic to humans. At the time, oxygen was toxic to them, so they never ventured from their home world, as they required the atmospheric conditions in order to live. Another common theme is Selegians were known for their incredible intellect, but most importantly, their deep wisdom. And interestingly enough, their telepathy consumed every part of their society, to the point of having no written or spoken language. This is because they could simply communicate through their minds of others and attain whatever information they needed. The 30th species is known as the Hysalarians. This was a species of Nakata del Gormo, the being that is said to have been Grandmaster Yoda's first Jedi Master. They were a species with a serpentine lower body and a humanoid upper body. They had 4 arms, 4 eyes, and they seemed to have a deep understanding of the mysticism of the Force, remaining with the Aang-Ti monks as some of the first beings to truly begin to understand the Force. Besides these 27, there were 9 other firstborn species that were mentioned in the early texts. However, many of these species are new introductions by way of supernatural encounters, or they simply don't have any information about them whatsoever. The names of these species are the Jeralek, the Muab, the Shola, the Volgax, the Osarians, the Asmuru, the Tempestro, and the Patho. Now, Supernatural Encounters claims that the Celestials also created the wills of the Force, the wills themselves. However, we have chosen not to include them in this list, since this directly conflicts with what George Lucas had said about the wills, which is that they live in the midichlorians, and are in essence, the will of the Force itself. It is possible that Supernatural Encounters was written prior to Lucas making these statements though, which means that this is simply a continuity error. But moving on, we here at the Archives would also like to theorize that Yoda's species was among the firstborns that were not mentioned, and that this is why Yoda's species is so mysterious. This is just speculation, but again it makes sense. If the species of Yoda's master, Nakata Del Gormo, is here, then surely Yoda's species may be as well. But of course, no name, no history has been given about Yoda's species, and there will likely never be an explanation, which works out just fine according to Lucas's vision. However, in the context of the firstborns and in the history of the galaxy, it does make too much sense for Yoda's species to be among them. So now that we've talked all about the very first people to walk the galaxy in Star Wars, and what we know about some of the first species, let's continue with our story, as we reach Chapter 2, the Bedlam Spirits. Of all of the Celestials, Watsek remained deeply scornful of his former brothers and sisters, those who had fallen into darkness and depravity. Watsek was so disdainful of the tiny movers, the humans, disgusted with how easily manipulated they were, and how easily they turned to violence. Watsek sought to create beings that would not falter, but could use their vast power to guide the coming inhabitants of a new dimension and galaxy. At this time, the firstborn species were still in the process of being created and evolved, and Watsek felt like they needed guides. He knew that he should have informed Luxos and the other Celestials of his grand plan, but then he decided to instead keep it a secret, concerned that his brothers and sisters would reject his idea and plan. Instead, he decided it was far better to ask for forgiveness than permission, and to do what needed to be done. After all, he refused to stand by and allow another fall to occur. Another Father of Shadows had to be prevented. The other Celestials would thank him later. However, his feelings of anger towards them, and towards his fallen brothers, and the secrecy of his current ambitions and actions birthed within him feelings of egotism, remoteness, impatience, and apathy. Bitterness, resentment created a dark song hidden within his very soul. While he had not fallen to the dark side, and certainly had not become like those before, he was now seeded with dark feelings, and the seed of the dark side itself, the Song of Penumbra, then poured into each of his 4 creations, and as a result, he unintentionally engineered the fall that he was attempting to prevent. The dark side had reached the new galaxy. Born out of Watsek's conflicted state, each of the Celestials' 4 creations, his children, took on traits and required the others to remain in balance. Watsek named each of them after what had compelled their creation, and in doing so, he reached into their very essence, shaping their beings so that they would come to be known as the Bedlam Spirits. The first he named Telotni, which in tongue of the Celestials meant art and pride. Since she was represented by mass itself, she was shaped into the image of the most beautiful of forms, which Watsek decided was a human woman. The flaw she inherited directly from Watsek was egotism. The second of his children was named Horlis, whose name was derivative of the celestial term meaning unconstrained and timeless. He was represented by a formless, a shifting blob of purple and pink color that appeared to have command of a metaphysical concept, using an art which he referred to as metastyling. We aren't entirely sure what this is, but he considered more subtle forms of power display as being superior and more tasteful. The flaw that he inherited from Watsek was remoteness. The third was Koldana Sene, the term that denoted dynamism and change. Cold Dana Sine was represented by the mystery and excitement of masslessness, and his embodiment was that of a flat dark circle with strange orange wisps that seemed to form a face. He was excitable, who had a childlike wonder and concepts about existence that fascinated him. This Bedlam spirit desired to know every aspect of life, death, form, substance, and time, though he was particularly proud of an invention which he called anti-concepts. However, his flaw was impatience, and last of the Bedlam spirits was Splendid Ap, a name belonging to the principles of time, as well as motion and space. He was represented by a pink pyramid with a strange symbol on it. Of all of the Bedlam spirits, he did not communicate the normal way that they did, but rather spoke in a strange and an indecipherable dialect. And while his siblings, particularly Telotni, treated Ap as though they were the dumbest one, he was in fact the most intelligent of all of the spirits that had been created. But the issue was, he inherited a terrible trait, apathy. But all of the spirits' flaws came to light almost immediately to Watsek, as he witnessed their negative traits before his very eyes. Although each of them had been made in secret, Luxos would find out and arrived to confront Watsek. Immediately when the chief of the Celestials had arrived and seen the creation, Watsek was thrown into deep remorse and regret. The Watsek Celestial immediately confessed what he had done, and he had told his brother Luxos that he had desired each of his offspring to embody each of the 4 precepts, to make something beautiful, but instead, they were flawed. They represented 4 negative traits of evil. If even one of the Bedlam spirits were not present with the collective group, they would be thrown out of balance, and war would be spread across the new galaxy. Watsek admitted that he had made a terrible mistake in creating them, and that he now feared that in his own anger and pride, the very thing that he sought to prevent would once again come to pass. Finally, Luxos would speak, responding that the Father of Lights, the Supreme Maker, had sent him a vision of what Watsek was saying, and that is why he arrived in the first place. He reminded them what their father had told him, that evil would find a way into the realm no matter what, even though this was much sooner than expected. According to the vision given to Luxos by the Supreme Maker, a shroud would darken the galaxy, though not for all time, and not to eradicate all life. In each age, evil would come, and along with evil, those would arrive with the light. In this way, the Chief of the Celestials prophesied the cycle of the very Star Wars universe and the history to follow it. Evil would rise in each era, whether in the form of the Sith or something else, but goodness and light would meet the challenge each time. But this did not soften the heart of Watsek. He was filled with grief, and more importantly, shame over his creations. And he said this, "Perhaps I should unmake my progeny and forestall this calamity." However, what he did not know is that the Bedlam spirits had already awoken and had heard the entire conversation. Each of them had thoughts about their maker destroying them for simply existing, and in a split moment, each of the siblings felt one another's emotions and pain. Telotni was terrified, perceived death as a threat to her perfect form. Cold Dana Sine was excited by experiencing death. Horless pondered the meaning of death. Splendid Ap, however, was nothing but pure logic, and decided to move himself and his siblings out of the way of danger. Not understanding how his powers worked, however, Splendid Ap would then project himself through time on instinct, accidentally discovering the world between worlds. He wouldn't need much time though deciphering exactly what this realm was, but he was instantly worried that the Celestials would find them. He would learn a quick truth though, that the world between worlds was not a dimension to other universes, as it was bound to the Sky River Galaxy, but he did quickly find a place far away from them that had been created, both in distance and in the timeline, projecting himself and the rest of his siblings to the year 0 BBY. It was here that we actually get the story of when Leia and the Stormtroopers encountered the 4 powerful beings known as the Bedlam Spirits. During this event, each of the spirits claimed to have heard a strange voice within them, urging them to give in to their own desires and believing themselves to be the gods of this galaxy. Telotni listens to the voice and comes to believe that she is an all-powerful goddess. She convinces herself that she has created everything with matter and even humankind itself. Splendid Ap heard the voice when he was projecting through the world between worlds, the voice told him that he could be an all-powerful god in control of time itself. However, being apathetic, he dismissed the voice outright as illogical. When Leia, who was being chased by stormtroopers, stumbled upon the spirits arguing, all of them noticed her immediately and wonder if Telotni was the one that made her, calling her a little mover. Telotni, though, doesn't know if she made her, but takes credit anyway, much to the annoyance of the other spirits. The stormtroopers, however, then appear, and Telotni's siblings accuse her of being uncreative since all of the stormtroopers look alike. Telotni, in order to save face, accuses them of distracting her and causing an oversight. So Telotni seeks to correct this apparent mistake, turning the stormtroopers' bodies into a solid diamond, at least one of them, killing him instantly. Horliss, though, scoffs at her decision, insisting that she could make a more subtle improvement. In response, he immediately turns Leia's heart into a diamond, killing Leia as well. Taking his challenge, Telotni decides to combine the remaining stormtroopers into a grotesque mass of flesh and limbs, and in her words, making it more interesting. Of course, the stormtroopers die here too. Each one of the Bedlam spirits feels the light of life snuff out. They can sense it as each of the tiny movers die and are all appalled by it, finding death to be distressing and wrong. And then, the dark voice speaks again within Cold Dana Sene, telling him that the drama was exciting and that they should bring about more death to unfold. Horliss then decided that substance and form was boring and that they should all leave. Telotni refused to clean up her mess and restore the tiny movers to how they were before her siblings insisted that they do it. App eventually complies, if for nothing else to ensure that they didn't cause too much harm. He uses his power to restore Leia and the stormtroopers back to life, but accidentally sends all of the stormtroopers 8,000 years into the past in the process. And with that, Splendid App takes his siblings and slingshots back into a point in the past that they could recognize and identify, when the universe was still young and the firstborn species had completed their evolutionary cycles. Horliss cautioned them, noting that he understood something that he had not before. The others in the galaxy were in many ways like they were, creatures with sentience and desires, and as Telotni did not wish to be interfered with, neither did they. Telotni countered that these were lesser beings though, neither as powerful or wise as she was. Should they not be directed by those who were more powerful, their betters? Horliss argued that they had the Celestials to guide them, but Telotni noted that it was the Celestials who had wanted to destroy the spirits in the first place. In truth, she had been burned by not receiving the love of her creator, and that is why she desired to be worshipped by all of the little things in the galaxy, to fill that void within her. But Horliss said that they were not the same. Telotni concluded that she and her siblings were destined to rule though, and it was for this reason alone that the Celestials wished for them to be destroyed. Horliss did not have all of the answers, and though a part of him said that he should stay and watch over his siblings, he was angered by Telotni, so he proposed that they should all depart for other realms, places that had no sentience, places that they could all call their own. However, Telotni said no, and two of her siblings, Cold Dana Sene and Splendid App, agreed with her. Horliss was saddened, but departed for another realm, giving into his flaw of remoteness, even though his siblings were saddened to see him leave. Back in the past, Wutsek panicked at having lost his children immediately after creating them. One moment he had been talking to his brother Luxos, and the next, his children vanished. However, Luxos was gifted with farsight and could see into the reaches of time and space instantaneously. He began narrating to Wutsek everything that was happening with the Bedlam spirits, telling him how they discovered the world between worlds and made a mistake in the deep future. From the Celestials' perspective in the past, the spirits had now traveled to a point in time where they'd essentially be frozen in place until the time stream would catch up to them. Wutsek expresses that there is so much harm that they could do if they are left on their own though. They are inexperienced and bereft of love or guidance. He believes they will certainly run from him if he ever attempted to get close. But then Wutsek has a thought. Why not just ask their father, the Supreme Maker, to unmake the Bedlam spirits before they can cause any harm? It is here that Luxos gives us an extremely important piece of knowledge concerning the Supreme Maker, the god of the Star Wars universe. Luxos says this: "It is not his will to force any against their will to choose love. peace or justice, and wisdom, lest there not exist those things, but only the domination of mindless servitude. Thus it is said this gift of freedom is greater still, and to choose love the greatest response to it. Each of your offspring, as each of my offspring, must be allowed their free course. Love and compassion with light and life. Hate and destruction with darkness and death. All are even free to change their course, should they choose. His meaning here is that love and justice could not exist if one is simply forced by a higher power to feel those things. Each being must choose their own path and live out the positive or negative consequences of that taken path. Watsek once again frets that they won't know light from dark, but his brother Luxos counters by saying that no being has been deprived of a conscience, even the Bedlam spirits. He then finishes the passage by saying this: "Just as your form shifts and swirls, so too is your mind in turmoil. But take heart. A great time of good and evil must pass, in which many things must come about and be tested, so that it is proven for all time, and by demonstration that the course of darkness is the road to ruination. Then a new thing will be brought to fruition, and those who have chosen the light will remain forever in it. Do not let your soul be anxious, for that which will be introduced will have been introduced anyway." The conversation between Luxos and Watsek then ends, and time passes. And now we have arrived at Chapter 3, Rising Malevolence. We roughly estimate it to be around the era of 1 million BBY when the following events occur. By this point in time, the firstborn species have already begat offspring, whether through life-shaping methods, reproduction, or crossbreeding. At this point, all was peaceful in the galaxy. Hyperdrive technology wasn't exactly something that had been invented yet. However, the ancients didn't require it because they had the hypergates. The hypergates were a brilliant invention by the Gree. This is what kept the very first galactic civilization thriving. No sort of communal government had been formed, so there were no republics or empires, just a collection of tribes, kingdoms, and people peacefully interacting with one another. They shared their ideas with one another, along with their vegetation, livestock, technology, and other resources that they needed, using a bartering system. At the time, the Quath were designing a similar system with the Infinity Gates, using the help of both the Celestials and the knowledge of the Gree. Many were beginning to search out the infinite mysteries of the Force as well, but no real religions had been formed yet, besides perhaps the Ang-Ti monks. Elsewhere, the Wookiees had just learned how to climb trees and create settlements. The Gungans thrived on their world of Lehon, and Tatooine was a lush and a tropical paradise. Living in this paradise were the native Kumunga, the star dragon Dwina Gwagwin, the manta-like Oswath Swamp, all flew together throughout the boundless sea of stars, pondering the mysteries of creation. This was a primitive, but a beautiful time in galactic history. A time when the strange and the abnormal was average, and what would only come to be spoken of in fairy tales and holociphers were everyday occurrences. All the while, the Celestials stood as watchmen, sentinels over a young galaxy, a guiding hand ensuring that it grew as planned. However, things would not remain as peaceful as it was. A dark shadow cast its way across a naive universe. With Horlus gone, the rest of the Bedlam spirits remained. Watsek's prophecy would come to pass, and they grew far from balance. As time went on, Telotni grew more vain, more selfish, deceitful. She had become deeply impacted by Horlus leaving, so much that she became overprotective of her siblings, fearing that they too would leave. And so she clung with them, along with the promise that Splendid App offered endless knowledge, and that Koldana Sene offered the opportunity to bring forth new things without constraint. And so for now, the other two remained with Telotni. They were like unruly children that didn't fully comprehend the difference between good and evil, and yet their power boundless. Around this time, they were approached by the celestial Luxos, who imparted Watsek's deep remorse for having made the rash statement that they had all overheard. Their creator was deeply remorseful. In an effort to provide them with a home where the spirits could be taught, guided, and loved, Luxos offered them a place among the Celestials, an opportunity to join their ranks. For a moment, they perceived the harmony, the warmth, the joy, a reunion with others of their kind. But Telotni snuffed out such feelings and quickly warned the other spirits that this was a trap designed by Watsek. Deep down, she did not truly believe this, but part of her feared that joining the Celestials would mean laying down her godhood, returning to the role of servant. She would hiss to her siblings, twisting the sincere offer of love and friendship, changing it to one of suspicion, that their greatest fear that the Celestials would destroy them, or worse, make them slaves. As out of balance as they were, Cold Donna Sine decided to believe Telotni, as her flaw of impatience disallowed him from trusting anyone. Splendid App was uncertain, but his logic dictated that the beings that posed the greatest threat to them were the Celestials, so he trusted his lying sister. However, it is said that if Horlus had remained with them, that things would have gone much different. The three spirits traversed the galaxy for a long period of time, watching the firstborn and the Celestials guarded over them, and Telotni grew jealous of their love. She could at any time have appealed to the Celestials, rejoined them, but the longer she stood apart from them, the more she felt alienated and bitter. She could not humble herself. She decided to find her own way of getting the love and worship that she desperately craved. The spirits began to devise a plan on how to usurp control of the galaxy. This was when her heart and the hearts of her siblings turned to darkness. At last, they discovered the means of ridding the galaxy of the Celestials. They had a weakness. The Celestials were not masters of their offspring. They were only their guides. If they, or the principles that they had left, were rejected by any of their protected races, they would be forced to leave, as the Supreme Maker had long ago issued a decree that they could not interfere with the free will of a sapient race. In an effort to remain hidden, the spirits would craft a small realm of their own away where they could hide from the Celestials as they plotted. It was a pocket dimension, beyond the reach of both real space and hyperspace, but somehow twisted and wrong. It was an inverted galaxy of strangely colored suns strewn amidst a charcoal and crimson firmament. It would later come to be known by many names, such as Other Space, or the Anti-Force, or Muspili. But officially in the book, it is called Elathurion, a word which meant Veiled Fortress. It was here when the spirits envisioned strange new things to excite them. They created a demented galaxy, a hideous domain forged in mockery of the Skyriver universe. There, they schemed dark ideas, and found that many who had pledged their allegiance to Telotni found themselves as prisoners to be experimented on. Sine found great pleasure in creating horrific races of violent creatures, the antithesis of peaceful ways that the Celestials had made. The beings that inhabited Other Space were twisted, mutated versions of beings from real space, or they were the offspring of twisted imagination. They had all innately cruel and selfish tendencies, desiring only domination and personal glory. These species built grand cities and populated worlds in this backwater realm. Of these disgusting specimens, the two species that stood out were known as the Rakata and the Hutts. Telotni found a great liking in the Rakata, and therefore taught them directly, preaching to them about a strict structure to enslave others for their personal pleasure, to be cannibalistic, domineering, and to use only the dark side of the Force. Cold Donna Sine kept the Hutts for his liking. He put them aside for a special purpose. And after many years in which the rogue offspring of Watsek were neither seen nor heard of, Telotni made her plan known and placed it in motion, tasking Splendid App to create windows on every world so that the firstborn and all their offspring would see them appear as colossal apparitions in the sky and hear Telotni's echoing voice, screaming across the galaxy. Telotni gave herself the name Onrai, which meant honor. She did this to reflect the esteem and reverence of her role as Mother Goddess. As she spoke to the masses, she had knowledge that in the distant times of the past, the name had been an older connotation, which meant without light. And as the Celestials were beings made of light, this seemed an appropriate moniker for Telotni, as she desired to snuff all light out. She issued a grand speech full of lies to the entire galaxy, claiming that it was she who shaped the firstborn species, and that the Celestials just wanted to hold them back from their greatness and glory. She promised the firstborn knowledge, power, and the path to greater heights. The offspring of the firstborn began to question whether the firstborn were holding them back, and even some of the firstborn began to question what the Celestials were hiding. Yet many of the species regarded Telotni's statement as lies, but they could also feel a time of great evil on the horizon, and so they began to prepare. Some of the ones who had been deceived came to fear the reprisal of the seemingly all-powerful Celestials. Giving their belief over to the words of Telotni, many of them would go into hiding, attempting to avoid the sight of their overlords. Responding to the hysteria though, the Celestials strove to make their own announcement and to warn the galaxy. The Celestials collectively issued this statement: "Do not give in to fear of this Onrai, for she is a goddess of nothing. We are the true architects of this galaxy. Do not be induced to serve her out of fear or lust of her secrets, for then we would be forced to depart from you, and this would grieve us. For you are our offspring, and we are your loving guides, and obeisance we pay to the Eternal alone." Luckily, the vast majority of the firstborn species rejected Telotni's claims, as they valued the gifts and endowments with both technology and powers in the Force that they already had. However, the Quoth were led down the dark path when their curiosity got the better of them. Telotni came to the Quoth, pouring out more of her discord, lies, but also knowledge. At the time, they had still been in the midst of developing their Infinity Gate technology and attempting to spread it across the galaxy. Telotni said to them, "Why should the Gree alone be famous for their portals? Are not the Quoth designs as wondrous, even more so than the Gree?" The Quoth decided to make the portals of gargantuan size, large enough to fit entire starships through, but they also adopted a new design philosophy for the tech. Rather than having the portals harness hyperspace, which is what the Gree did, the Infinity Gates would access a different pocket dimension known as the Realm of Infinity. In this realm, the Quoth controlled a station that they called the Power of Infinity. There isn't much of a breakdown on how this all works on a technical level though, but apparently it was dangerous and a foolish dimension to access and to toy with, enough to where the Gree declared the Infinity Gates to be an abomination, thus shattering the once close relationship between the Gree and the Quoth. The first phase of Telotni's grand plan was now over, and she entered into the next. With Cold Donna Sine and Splendid App, the three spirits ventured back into the world between worlds, and Telotni found what she was looking for: a gateway directly to the Prime Universe, from which the Celestials had stemmed. She convinced her siblings to violate yet another universal law, to open a trans-dimensional door directly to the Prime Universe. Telotni promised her siblings that they had exciting and new information, new prospects to explore, seducing them with knowledge and false promise. And into the Prime Universe they went, App to seek knowledge of old things, Sine to seek the new, Telotni to seek the people of Eretz. Splendid App learned that Eretz held other secret doors to other dimensions. Sine learned of the Father of Shadows, and those fallen Celestials that ruled there as gods. But all of this knowledge came at a price, and he was ever after change, twisted to pure evil. Telotni learned that there were many amongst the thriving populace of these called humans who craved domination and dominion, others who craved escape, and yet those that sought adventure. Not to mention, they all looked a lot like she did. Watsek had modeled her shape after a human female. Telotni decided that they would be easy to manipulate, and so she would appear to them as a powerful alien goddess, providing a way into a new and a better life. She enticed the humans with promises of power, wealth, and adventure. Gathering these pilgrimage of humans, Telotni brought them in a large vessel created by Splendid App over into the Sky River universe. Desiring to finally have her followers, she placed them in the far eastern quarter of the galaxy, the place that we now know as the Unknown Regions. And there, two worlds of paradise were fashioned, Kobal and Urtha. To keep a pretty long story short, Telotni would watch over as the humans redeveloped their society with the help of the new, advanced technology given to them by the Bedlam spirits. Over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, human civilization rose and fell as they carried over militaristic and domineering ways from the original Prime universe, evil that was given to them by the Father of Shadows. Their warring, their pollution would end up making both Cabal and Eartha uninhabitable. Slowly the human race would dwindle, but Telotni ensured that a remnant of them would survive, preserved so that they could spread their warlike ways to the rest of the young galaxy. Telotni's goal was that through these humans, the other species would be corrupted against the four precepts, and therefore end the Celestials. But what Telotni did not know was that over the years, the Celestials had secretly visited the humans, discovering that they could be taught. For Telotni was not as clever as she envisioned herself to be. Many had come to see through her lies, and secretly began following the teachings of those that they called beings of pure light. Some of the humans had accepted the four precepts of love, justice, power, and wisdom, ready to reject everything that Telotni had cut into them. What's surprising is Splendid App was aware of all of this, but he did not share this with any of his siblings. His secrets were his own. Soon enough though, Telotni guided the Quath into discovering the human population and installing one of their infinity gates on Eartha, allowing humans to gain access to the wider galaxy, specifically the world of Coruscant, which at the time was called Notron. And now we reach chapter 4, the Ascendancy of the humans. In this new era, due to an internal uprising, the human population had reorganized its original leadership from Cabal and Eartha into three main groups. The first was the Universal Alliance, which was led by the 9 kings of Cabal, the United Confederation of Zell, which was the name after they were led by General Zell, who had united the 13 formerly divided nations of Eartha, and the Sons of Freedom, who rejected both parties. The Alliance was transported via the Infinity Gates to the planet of Terra. The Confederation, still led by President Zell, was transported to Notron. Now, according to the histories given in other legend sources, the name for the ancestral race of humans was called the Zell. Galactic historians heavily debated on whether ancient humans calling themselves Zell was the name for themselves in their language, or if they chose the name for themselves after a city or after a leader. But it seems that Supernatural Encounters has firmly decided to go with the latter, stating that Notron humans, at least, decided to name themselves the Zell after their leader. For easy comprehension, we're going to continue to refer to the species as the humans and the man as Zell, unless we're reading directly from a historical document in the lore. Anyway, many humans came to revile both Telotni, who they knew as Onrai, and the Celestials due to their interference on both of their homeworlds. Many of them who thought this way made up the Sons of Freedom, who were not content to follow either the Alliance or the Confederation. The Sons of Freedom instead would take to the stars themselves, guided by a pilot by the name of Antonia Corellia. However, in anger of their defiance, Telotni would open a wormhole and forcefully transport them to a planet close to Notron. This planet would soon to become known as Corellia, named after the pilot who led the Sons of Freedom. The human population on Notron was finding their home there quite nicely, as the planet was green with many oceans, not too dissimilar from the planets that they had come from. However, it was already somewhat sparsely populated by the Tong species, who didn't take too kindly to the new invaders. President Zell was aware that mankind had never before truly been united, so he instituted several laws to ensure his goal of unification. President Zell designated a single language to be dominant among the humans, and during this time, a few curious visitors from the nearby worlds of Duros and Bathawi would also come by. Apparently, they too had some influence over the common language that was being developed, as would the native Tong. What resulted was a language called Notron Cant, which would eventually become Old Galactic Standard, and over many more millennia, evolve into Galactic Basic Standard, or as we know it, Basic. A written alphabet called Abresh was also developed, named for the first two letters, Auric and Besh. These languages would end up spreading across the core worlds to thousands of more alien species, who then grew increasingly more fascinated with this new race that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. The Infinity Gates had been designed to send travelers anywhere in the galaxy that held another star temple, and the Quoth were at this time busily erecting them across the galaxy at a rapid rate. While the humans were content to settle on Notron, others saw the Infinity Gates as an opportunity to get away from their neighbors, or their oppressors, to erect kingdoms and empires of their own. In this way, other core worlds came to be inhabited by humans at this time, such as the planet of Anaxis, Shawkin, Metelos, along with many other worlds. President Zell had attempted to greedily control the use of the Infinity Gates on Notron for himself, charging massive fees on those attempting to travel. This was not to Telatni's liking, however, as she needed the humans to spread. So when Zell defied her, she disintegrated him. And with his death, the Infinity Gate became open and free to all who would travel for any bold and ambitious reason. The humans would seek a home farther from the core. Among the earliest to escape the authoritarianism of the Zell Empire on Notron were the Second Sons of Freedom. Colonies were established on distant planets where friendships and bonds were formed with numerous races that they encountered. And from ports of these worlds, families and tribes would venture further out into the Great Hypergates, which were now spread across the galaxy. Political dissidents and those looking to establish their own power base were encouraged to settle everywhere that they could, and colonization began on Iriadu in the Outer Rim, as well as other systems. And this is why humans are basically everywhere in the galaxy. The Celestials, knowing from whence the humans came and their cursed origins under the Father of Shadows, recognized the danger that was on the horizon, while encouraging the other races into a cautious friendship with the humans, who many of which were now sharing planets. They also gave a warning about mankind. Do not imitate the ways of humans, or fail to remember their danger, for although good exists in some, a curse lays upon them. Moreover, do not be induced to violence, for then we would be forced to depart from you, and this would be grievous for all. Over time, the races of the galaxy would forget the warnings of the Celestials and embrace the new ways of war, the sport hunting that the humans brought. And as humans spread throughout the galaxy and new planets, some of their branches changed physically over time as they adapted to new environments. Others mated with compatible humanoids so that their unique genetic differences arose, giving rise to near-human races. This is from whence others like the Twi'leks, the Zeltron, the Chiss, the Imbarans, the Pantorians, and other near-humans originate. As the generations passed on, the humans of Notron tended to forget that they had come from another world entirely, let alone another universe. And though a certain amount peacefully initially existed between the humans and the Tong, as more time went on, the human population kept growing and spreading. The great city was now being constructed on the world, causing larger and larger sections of Notron to be remade into a lavish and a sprawling metropolis. As this never-ending city began to expand upon once natural environments, the increasingly agitated Tong began to see their world change in ways that they would never approve. The human leader, Zell II, was greedy, cruel, and xenophobic, much like his father. Against the warnings of many in the human ruling council, he continued to disregard the wishes of the native Tong, considering them primitive brutes and pests. The many human leaders continued to warn Zell that he needed to be more respectful of their neighbors. But in response, the president decided to rename Notron into the human world of Coruscant, depicting the glittering jewel that their great city was beginning to resemble. For the Tong, this was the final straw, and they demanded a treaty be signed to limit the continued human expansion in certain regions of the world. But convincing Zell II was impossible. He had the treaty document reworked so that numerous loopholes were inserted, and although the Tong were a wise people, they did not yet comprehend things like deceit or obscurement. After all, in the ancient day, one was able to trust the word of his neighbor. So while they thought that business had been taken care of, the humans continued to build over the land, seemingly violating the treaty that the Tong proposed. When they attempted to take the matter to court, they were faced with all of the contingencies and loopholes that had been crookedly inserted by Zell. All attempts to rewrite the treaty or negotiate the terms were met with silence or hostility. 3 more human presidents would pass by, and the Tong now were physically protesting expansion. A great number of humans began to support their claims, and were now being quite vocal for Coruscant leadership to listen to the Tong. But unfortunately, a deep-seated corruption ran through each of the presidents of Zell, and the current one, President Anaxis, was even more vile than any Zell had ever been. He authorized the human battalion to use force against the protesters, as well as started propaganda that painted the Tong as brutes, extremists. After this horrific event, the Tong brooded and bitterly debated their next action, determining that their words would go unheeded. It was decided that the only thing the humans understood was destruction, and that once they demonstrated this, the Zel would withdraw and allow the Tong to live in peace. The Tong blew up the royal chamber of Zel, and although they did so much without causing harm to any sentience, President Anaxis framed it as a pretext for war. To convince the public to support him, the Snake of a Man apparently took a page out of the Sith's book and secretly killed several of his own military leaders, specifically those that expressed misgivings about betraying the Tong, and then he had their bodies placed within the destroyed buildings. With a convincing act of terrorism having been brought to light, the human population now supported the outing of the Tongs and their destruction. The battalions came into their territory, destroying their homes and their sacred locations. As a fiercely proud people, it did not take much for the Tong to conclude that violence was now the only means to reclaim their home, and war was inevitable. It was here when the Celestials took notice and quickly attempted to intervene before the Tong were dragged into a cursed war. The Celestials pleaded with them not to pursue this course, offering to escort them through the Gree Hypergate to a beautiful new world, far away from the humans of Coruscant. They also repeated their warning and the consequences of not following their word. But the Tong accepted no such resolution. They believed the conflict had become too personal. The Tong destroyed the Hypergate and severed the ties to their celestial guardians, abandoning their once peaceful ways to become warriors, a path which would forever dominate their destiny. In doing so, they lost their immortality and could now be killed just as the rest. And thusly, a war began between races upon Notron that would go down in history, the First War of the Galaxy. The only surviving historical documentation on this ancient time and warring galactic history is a poem written by the Tong. That ancient poem is called the Daweda Verda. This poem is more than 100 verses divided into 11 chapters, but most have been able to translate the dead language of the Tongs into just 10 verses from chapter 9. The poem was written by the Tong after a grand victory over the humans, one that they collectively referred to as the Zel. By this point, the humans had won battle after battle, reducing the alien population with each blow. The Tong leader, Doom of Umbara, had just been murdered in a battle and was succeeded by Rexitu, who the Tong people deemed the unconquerable. The Tong were now few in number, but decided to go to battle once more, to perish in one last conflict with the humans. They were outnumbered drastically. However, something unexpected happened that day, something that would change things. A freak volcanic eruption occurred which destroyed the city of the Zel and sent the rest of mankind running. The Tong people took this as a sign of divine favor and dubbed themselves the Delwerda Verda, which translates to the Shadow Warriors. They then wrote a poem of the same name that night of their victory. The 10 translated verses describe how the event went down from the Tong's perspective, which we will now read. And so upon his pyre burned the doom of Almara, and the warrior band stood as ragged bandits in zigzag lines of mourning. With the dawn, the flat-faced Zel would come, cackling and howling, oozing mirth and tricks. Finding the shade of the doom departed, and the Tongs unprotected. And so with the dawn would our woe be revealed. Our once bright armaments would become stacked with grave goods, trophies for the Zel children. Our flesh would become smoke given to uncaring gods, and the sky would forget our names. With the death upon him, Rexitu the Unconquerable prepared to be stripped of all by his enemy, but vowed that his honor would be the last to be torn away. And so the Unconquerable gathered his kinsmen and his oath-girdlings alike. They polished their fearsome helms, that they might flash even in the weak sun of Notron. They rewrapped the hilts of their weapons, and pounded straight the shafts, so that they may slake their thirst in Zel Ichor a final time. Assembled, they ascended, in taut Tong lines, to the high place where the Reaver had stacked his standard before it was cast down into the mire. They gazed out over the gathering places, and walking ways of Great Zel where they scaled peak and cradled valley. The lines of lights ordering the night. They unfurled the Tong banner, reversed, a reckless thing snapping in the dark, awaiting Zel eyes. and they performed ceremonies of leave-taking, for now they had died to the world and must be remade among the stars. When the dawn came, the Zell awakened and saw the Tongs upon the high place and were afraid, for the morning light caught the glint of the helms and the weapons and created phantom warriors made of dazzle and distance. But the cleverest of them were not deceived and saw how they were few, and so they assembled without haste, merry in mockery, and prepared to march. And in the high place, we awaited death. But then came a shaking of the ground, and the sun's warm light was eclipsed by a bright and a terrible fire that exploded from the rock. The patterns of great Zell shivered and broke, and after this came darkness, as the very air turned to black ash. The Zell fell on their faces in terror, and from the high place we ran in haste to meet them, and we were cloaked in the shadow. The Maker had come to unmake, and the Tongs would be his instruments. According to supernatural encounters, the Tong were desperate and had their priests reach out to the Celestials for help. However, it wasn't they who answered the call, but rather one of the Bedlam spirits, Sine. It would be revealed that it was Sine who engineered the volcanic eruption. The Tong had then taken advantage of the chaos and nearly wiped out the entire battalion of Zell. The war would rage on for another 2 years after this event. And although the humans were weakened by this defeat, the 13 nations rallied together and forced the Tong off of Notron. The Tong victory and the spirit Sine's influence had been far too displeasing to Telotni though, so she snatched victory from their hands and brought the humans back from near extinction to clutch out an otherwise impossible victory. And so the alien people would escape their own extinction, fleeing through the Infinity Gate to find asylum on the planet known as Rune. The Tong would remain there for tens of thousands of years, only locating the planet of Mandalore around the time of 7000 BBY. But back to Notron and the humans. The humans quickly celebrated their victory and officially renamed the world Coruscant. With planetary peace now achieved, they went to work constructing their vast city, which would soon cover the entire planet. But the rot and the infestation within the human leadership would continue to affect the galaxy beyond Coruscant, just as the wicked Telotni had always intended. From this point forward, the galaxy is about to cross a threshold of which it will never return. As the tenebrous shadow stretched around the lives of the unaware universe, everything and everyone in it would get caught in the chokehold. Part 3: The Cosmic Wars. Chapter 1: Hate Leads to Suffering. During these early days of the galaxy, the humans were still very much under the spell of Telotni, making many of them who had not accepted the 4 precepts to become petulant, vile, and selfish. They were, in essence, the tools that Telotni had fashioned to create havoc and disarray in the galaxy. Currently, almost all of the firstborn races were still under the guidance of immortality provided by the acceptance of the 4 precepts, and Telotni needed a bomb to go off in order to shake all of the firstborn species out of their trust of the Celestials, and it would be the humans that would light that fuse. A company of poachers and treasure hunters snuck into Alasham, which was an interim world where it was rumored to have exotic creatures roaming in abundance and treasures that lay unguarded for the taking. The Alashan race were a very trusting people, enchanted with the alluring beauty of the cities that they'd created. The worlds of the Firstborn were all magnificent beyond compare, and the Alashanian cities were marvels even amongst these. Vices such as murder, theft, and greed were utterly foreign to their way of thinking, and when they saw the humans violating their world in this way, they gathered them up and threw them out of their world to the Infinity Gate which they had come. Furthermore, they destroyed the star chamber that the Quath had constructed, cutting themselves off entirely from the rest of the galaxy. The hunting party had been made up of members of the military and the ruling elite of Coruscant. They were all under the same sickening influence of the presidents of Zell, and just like with the Tong, they began to spread a tale of the vicious Alashans to the rest of the galaxy, those who tried to murder them and who might at any moment come to destroy the human race. These stories spread and caused an uproar in the gullible populace and the humans of Coruscant. The ever-watchful evil eye of Telotni saw a new way to corrupt the hearts and the minds of the galaxy. After all, fear leads to anger, and anger leads to hatred. She ordered Splendid App to make a small adjustment to the function of the Infinity Gates. They normally allowed creatures to harness the realm of infinity to travel between 2 points in space. But with this little tweak, it would now allow the Infinity Gates to project the power of infinity, sending a destructive wave across the galaxy to any target of choice. This, in essence, was the very first superweapon ever created in Star Wars lore, and of course, leave it to the evil president to announce the strike of the Alashan people, simply for the purpose of testing this new superweapon. The Alashan believed these threats to be nothing more than hot air and an empty boast. They knew that many of the humans talked a big game, but nothing like this had ever been seen, nor thought was possible in the galaxy before. Besides this, the firstborn and their offspring were under the direct protection from death and harm, conditional on each race's faithfulness to the principles of love, wisdom, and justice, the balance of power, precepts handed down from the Supreme Maker directly and passed on to them from the Celestials, their great guides. And that was why they were unprepared when the flash of light engulfed their planet, reducing their gorgeous, gleaming, beautiful cities, sprawling green gardens, lush life-nurturing forests, to nothing but ash. The Alashans themselves were protected by this immortality, which may have been a fate worse than death, as they had to helplessly watch it all happen right before their eyes. The warnings of the Celestials, to resist giving into fear, and the temptations of Onrai, secretly to Lotni, were after this abandoned by the Alashans and others. The Alashans would be changed forever. In unreasoning fury and bitterness, they began the construction of weapons of war. They would spend the following decades in underground isolation, erecting vast and impregnable walled cities of technological marvel and terror. Wondrous architecture, magnificent artifacts would no longer be produced by the Alashan people as they once were. Instead, they dismissed their celestial guardians and prepared for revenge. In doing so, they too cast off their immortality, as the Tongs had as well. Splendid App had again been tasked to open the hyper windows so that the rest of the galaxy could stand witness to the destruction of Alashan. Telotni again addressed the inhabited worlds and gave a new speech. In it, she insisted that she was the queen of the cosmos and the mother of all races. She portrayed the humans as a malignant force that brought calamity wherever they ventured. She told them that the Celestials were not giving them the tools to defend themselves, and that for all of their power and knowledge, all they had brought was misery. Telotni began and made a promise that any who chose to take a blood sacrifice to her would receive protection from the humans. Of course, what she didn't tell them was that doing that would cause them to violate the 4 precepts, to lose their immortality. From her words, many grew fearful and started to see the humans as a grave threat. Once again, the Celestials called out to have the firstborn pay no heed to the false goddess. However, this time, the races were not so quick to dismiss Telotni as they once had. The destruction of Alashan shook all of them to their core, and widespread hatred and paranoia of the humans gripped them. It was not long before Alashan took its revenge. From within their underground fortress cities, they fired a superweapon of their own design. The Infinity Gate on Coruscant was targeted directly and set ablaze, along with the entire metropolitan area of the new capital that housed the Star Temple. The wicked ruling elite class and the military leaders that had caused so much pain and panic were obliterated, and their hold on the human population of Coruscant shattered with it. But this strike from the Alashans was not a positive thing. They had glassed portions of Coruscant entirely, reducing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians to ash. This time, Telotni let it happen. She did not rescue mankind. In her eyes, they had served their purpose. With the Coruscant Infinity Gate decimated, and no Gree Hypergate to speak of, the humans were officially cut off, isolated from the rest of the galaxy. Again, no hyperdrive technology existed during this period of time, and interstellar flight had not yet been fully perfected, so they were forced to remain on their world of Coruscant, fearful, contemplating their own hubris. The spirits again opened the hyper windows for all to see the retribution of Alashan. Fear gripped the galaxy, gave way to anger, spreading the pestilence of war. The offspring of the firstborn, concerned that their cities and homes would become like those of Alashan, either began developing weapons of their own, or demanded the Celestials give them weapons. The Celestials would not provide implements of violence, and once again reminded the people of what they had stated time and time again. At seeing how their technology was being used, the Quath were dismayed. Not only this, but they were regarded as enemies by many in the galaxy. In shame, they renamed themselves the Qua, and determined that somehow they would pay for their sins. Yet, they also tweaked the Infinity Gates on their own worlds so that they too could be utilized as weapons if need be. Multitudes of civilization bowed before the false gods, severing the bond between themselves and those that had shaped them. And with this, Telotni's plot came to fruition, and many went to the star temples, offering blood sacrifices to her, worshipping her as instructed. The species of the galaxy lost their immortality en masse, and in this new season of fear and hatred, the galaxy began to further fragment. Now, only distrust and fear existed, where once only friendship reigned. The galactic community that had once been cultivated through the Hypergates and Infinity Gates were fragmented as each culture declared their own independence and sovereignty. The final part of the Bedlam Spirit's plan to win the galaxy to her way was through terror, a force that could not be defeated. That force would be comprised of her offspring, those who would be sent forth with vast armies at their back, ready to exact retribution for all who refused to accept the new order and rule in the galaxy. To this end, they unleashed the races bred from cruelty into the galaxy. They spread to many worlds, bringing violence and suffering in ways that made the humans look saintly. The Rakata landed on Alihon and forcefully enslaved the native Gungans. Many of them fled with the help of the Kumunga, who brought them to the oceanic moon over Naboo. The species that they created, known as the Hutts, landed on Varl, and there they began their own warrior-like empire. And now, because the vast majority of the races in the galaxy abandoned the Four Precepts, the Celestials officially departed for other realms of existence, unable to remain behind as guides that they had once been. But if only it had stopped there, the worst was yet to come. But breaking from all this cosmic drama for just a moment, one thing that Supernatural Encounters does not address is the Sith purebloods. According to many of the legends told to us here, most of the evil in the galaxy was either born from Telotni's lies or they came from other space. However, one thing that's overlooked is Korriban. The Sith were not only already there, but they knew the dark side before it was cool. While most galactic historians assume that the Sith culture began around 100,000 BBY, the Dark Jedi and one of the founders of the Sith Empire noted that much of the architecture of the Sith purebloods predates 200,000 BBY. According to Sorza's Sin, the Valley of Golg on Korriban is lined with monuments that stood long before the humans marched across Coruscant for the very first time. This means that they predate the human expansion, and even the call to commit sin by Telotni that she broadcasted over the entire galaxy. According to the timeline, the Sith purebloods were already steeped in the power of the dark side by this point. From what we can tell, the Sith purebloods are anomalies, as they were something like a product of the dark side. They seem to have almost evolved from it, though at this time it's uncertain whether it's because Korriban was a world naturally rich with the dark side, or if the pureblood species themselves that made up Korriban were the ones that corrupted it and made it that way. But at any rate, the Sith survived through a sort of symbiosis with the dark side of the Force. Korriban was a harsh, arid desert after all, so resources had to be fought for and conquered. The symbiosis of the Sith was quite simple. They fed on the dark side and empowered it, developed and perfected techniques of the dark side through it that were once thought to be impossible. In exchange, the dark side granted them power and wisdom to find and develop methods of survival, such as food and personal longevity, and eventually, glory, power. Though the purebloods had great power, the Sith at the time were not united. They lived in tribal circles that were led usually by one sorcerer, one who was responsible for the safety and protection of their people or tribe. The state of war between the Sith nations on Korriban was common in their society. But in this existence, this was not actually seen as tumultuous, but rather as the status quo. The Sith purebloods treated wartime as one on par with peace. They didn't, or perhaps couldn't, differentiate between a state of peace and a state of war. So the barbaric practices of Sith society were not viewed as being antagonistic, but rather integral and a big part of their lives. Luckily for future Sith Lords, the purebloods treated knowledge as equally sacred to bloodshed, and detailed the knowledge of their history, along with the powers of sorcery and alchemy that they also experimented with. They did this on tablets and scrolls. Very few of these records were destroyed during wartime, but were rather exchanged, stolen, or buried with their kings. I find it interesting that amid all the horrid creations from other space, and the scheming going on behind the cosmic veil, the Sith purebloods remain the original Darksiders in the Skyriver universe. Everyone has assumed that it was Telotni and the Bedlam spirits that brought evil into the galaxy, but they apparently overlooked the Sith, those who were already adept at using the dark side. But that's not surprising since they mostly kept to themselves during this time. Sith space is surrounded by a nebula known as the Stygian Caldera that acts as a sort of a natural barrier. No one was able to navigate this barrier without the power of the Force as their ally. But not only this, they had to be directly attuned to the dark side. From what we understand, no hypergates or infinity gates were constructed in or around Sith space, leaving them in total isolation for thousands of years. All the while, they practiced their dark arts behind closed doors and were generally left alone until much later in the timeline. But now, let's move on. Chapter 2. Things get even weirder. Telotni was not contented with simply having the spawn of Koldana Sene's experiments run rampant on the galaxy. She needed to firmly secure the entire realm's descent into darkness so that she would reign supreme forever. But there were still many races left that defied her, and so they would need a touch of the dark side made especially for them. To this end, she called for Sene and insisted that the two of them create direct children of their own, much like how Wutsec had created them. But instead of simply shaping them from matter and energy, the two of them would use their own seed to give birth to beings of darkness and power. Sene, though, had grown to hate his sister. However, he conceded to creating spawn with her, only so that they could watch her crash and burn. He knew that whatever the two of them made would be a product of Sene's own twisted mind and Telotni's inner malevolence and evil. Not even she would be able to fully control them as a result of this. And so she became pregnant with 4 beings that would come to haunt the galaxy for ages on end. The day Telotni gave birth was a dark one indeed. Perhaps one of the darkest days seen in existence. The first child of Telotni was a creature of abject horror. It was a being with a dripping, bloated sack for a body, and a squid-like head with tentacles hanging down from its mouth, 2 large wings that protruded from its back as well. Yet, it was his face that caused Telotni even to shudder and to seek to kill it. For it held a countenance of such unwavering evil that to look upon it for any length of time would cause any being to lose themselves, giving fully to madness. Telotni reviled anything that she perceived as ugly and wished to unmake her hideous child. But Sene laughed at it, kept her from killing the child, and instead, he named the boy Typhogem. True to his plan, Typhogem hated his mother. However, he came to have an affection for his father Sene alone once he realized that they had a shared contempt for Telotni. The two spent a lot of time together, and Sene would tell Typhogem of the Prime Universe, the strange sights that he saw there. In particular, Typhogem was fascinated by the Father of Shadows, and so took that moniker for himself. He was now determined to spread his shadow upon the inhabited planets of the galaxy, to shroud them in darkness of his own making, and from that day forth, Typhogem forever had a distinct hatred for humanity, as their form reminded him of his mother, who sought to destroy him. The second of Telotni's hellspawn was an amorphous creature, something like an insect with 1,000 legs that could reach out with its creeping webs into space. Sene affectionately referred to her as the Thieragor Argarat, which meant the blasphemous herald of the perpetual night. The child perceived that it would receive no love from the beings that spawned her, and so she, like her mother, determined to receive love and worship from lesser beings, and so she brought forth from many worlds, creeping things to follow and to praise her. Yet, it was the Killiks from whom she most sought worship, for they were from Firstborn and possessed the power to create technological wonders. However, only one nest of Killiks ever gave her that reverence that she so deeply desired, and to the others, she remained a symbol of pestilence and darkness. The third loathsome child was a sentient blob of oozing, morphing flesh that hovered in deep space. It had a distinct hunger for life energy, desiring to consume the force in living things. To this one, the name was given Uradrill. It was vulnerable in its naked form and requested wrappings. Splendid App would be the one to supply them in the form of large, interlocking golden plates that the scales of which formed a cube around the flesh mass. The creature would end up spawning its own, smaller clones, one of which, Waru, was a creature that Luke Skywalker would later meet in the distant future. Uradrill was the one that Telotni secretly feared the most, as she knew that its hunger would cause it to devour all that lived and breathed, perhaps even her. But it was the fourth, the final one, which was perhaps the worst of them all, believe it or not. A being of such revulsion and repugnance that even the utterance of its name brought horrific imagery of the worst kind. It was a dank gray ooze, one which poured violently out of Telotni, forming a bubbling pool. When Telotni looked upon it, a face rose to meet her. It was her face at first, but then it opened into a hideous grin that burst forth a bubbling, crimson mass of entrails and eyes. Sine laughed, as this one was called Nol Nol, which meant unrestrained growth. The first interaction with Nol Nol that Telotni had would scar her for the rest of her existence. It reformed itself into a head with no eyes, no nose, only a mouth and wings to keep it up to her eye level. The first thing the creature said to her was, "Not so beautiful on the inside, mother, if that is who you are." It would then give her a poem in an unknown language, prophesying her destruction. Telotni simply replied that the poetry was grotesque, just as he was. The gray, viscous liquid below now reached up, attached itself to the speaking head of Nol Nol, transforming itself into the ideal human form, a male. Does it sound more lovely if I read it to you like this? I can be anything to anyone, but in the end, I will always be death. When she did not respond, the creature gradually turned the body old, decaying it until it was a skeletal frame. Pieces of fake human flesh slopping to the ground. From the pile of bones, a thing rose up on 18 legs, 18 blinking eyes, the same amount of tentacles, a mouth full of spiky prongs. It continued to ask her questions in the form of a strange riddle spoken in a myriad of ancient languages, questioning her authority, her status as a goddess, and the supposed mother of all. Telotni refused to answer the riddles, most likely because she didn't understand the languages he was speaking them in, proving his point that she was a false goddess. He then expanded to fill the world, the skies around her, stating that he would devour all life one day, including that of his siblings, of her, and of every being on every sphere in the universe. Finishing off, Nol Nol stated that in the end, everything would simply be him, and one day, he would feast on himself, a never-ending cycle. Telotni demanded to know if he was going to serve her or not, but Nol Nol simply said that death does not serve, but rules as king over all, and all will be eaten by the worms. Disgusted, infuriated, Telotni dismissed her offspring and would have let them starve, but Sine stepped in, fed them his still living failed experiments. She refused to believe that those beings could be her children, and accused both Sine and Splendid App of bringing these abominations from elsewhere. She was beautiful. App disproved of her accusations by essentially stating that he had nothing to gain or lose, but that Sine had done so to cackle in her face. At last, Telotni addressed her children. She gave them a single command, that you go forth, conquer, destroy all who will not serve her, else they be unmade. And so, the ghastly hellspawn dispersed into other space, feeding on beings there, begetting their own horrid creations, until all that remained was a realm of pure nightmare. Soon, other space was a diabolical mirror of real space. It was filled with atrocious civilizations that worshipped the eldritch lords of the Bedlam spirits and their offspring. Once this was accomplished, Splendid App tore open several dimensional gates throughout the galaxy, flooding it with the black spawn from their realm. Nol Nol had no need for offspring. He could spread himself endlessly across star systems if he so chose. But what he could not do was survive in the vacuum of space, or cross space like his siblings could, and for that reason, he approached Splendid App in secret, requesting for a passage to be opened to a densely populated world, one where he could begin his feast. But Splendid, who up until now had only followed Telotni and Sine, had learned all that he had needed under the direction of his siblings. Not only this, but he was having misgivings about the actions now being taken. He he was ready to start moving forward with his own plan soon. And so, instead of doing as Nol Nol had requested, he threw the creature on an uninhabited world which was known as Mug Fallow. This would forever be the resting place of Nol Nol, where he would have to satiate himself on the grass, the small insects, the trees, until he could find a means of off-world through visitors of his domain. For many years, Nol Nol remained unknown until the brutal Vis Empire, against all good judgment, sought to use their jump gates to explore the world and enslave all upon it. Their arrogance and foolishness saw the entire Vis Empire and culture destroyed. The galaxy, however, was spared the release of Nol Nol due to the wisdom and action of several of the former slave races of this empire. But back in other space, Splendid was not the only one who had grown tired of Telotni. Sine was ready to move on her as well, and so he came to his sister with this speech. "Vain goddess, blind and stupid Telotni, our games are at an end, for I have long grown wary of you. Until now, you and I have been the vilest creatures in the galaxy. Yet now we have gone forth some even more Caligulous than we, who have been brought from the revolting darkness within you. I no longer wish to play this, for this is paltry and stale. Depart from my realm before I command my offspring to tear you asunder." Telotni's worst fears for so many eons ago had come to light, as she lost the only family that she ever had. She was disgraced, humiliated, and she vowed eternal hatred upon them, and departed from her siblings forever. But this event happened far too late to stop the horror that had now been unleashed upon the galaxy. Even though Telotni ventured to greater dimensions, what she left behind was so much worse. The Cosmic Wars had begun, plunging the galaxy into its first trilogy of conflicts that would last for the remainder of the Primordial Age. And with that, we reach Chapter 3, the Amprene Wars. It was a dark time for the galaxy. The Celestials, the guides of light who had been nurturing the young galaxy, were now gone. They had departed to other planes because their beloved firstborn had almost all but abandoned the ways of the Four Precepts, and so they were no longer able to remain with them. Living in isolated and fearful societies, the denizens of the Sky River continued to eye each other suspiciously, with weapons ready for attack or defense. But it was not their own neighbors that they had to worry about during this era. Rifts in reality violently tore open pores, beings of perdition born from the darkest pits of the void. Using the Infinity Gates, the offspring from other space spread across all the worlds, plunging the galaxy from end to end, top to bottom, into chaos. All of the Spirit Sine's corrupted races, they had arrived, taking in the teachings of species' superiority and domination, fostering the spirit of war as they went about desolating and destroying. The gods of the Dark World, known now as the Old Ones, sent their armies to carry out a destructive wave of unsuspecting populace. These creatures conquered worlds of their choosing, declaring themselves as rulers and emperors as they went. Those who submitted became slaves, those who would not faced slaughter. While many of them succeeded, the same number of them would fail. The people of the Sky River Galaxy were no longer ignorant to the ways of war, and some were able to repel the invaders from their worlds, or at least hold them at bay. In an interesting turn of events, evil wasn't the only thing that was contagious, but goodness and light found a foothold in order to prosper. Some beings from other space, despite their dark origins, even turned from evil and left behind that path. At the same time, others destroyed themselves through infighting, or destroyed fellow other space races before they could spread further harm. Humans were on both sides of the war, split directly down the middle. Half fought for the Sky River, the other half served the Old Ones. Such was the case with the Kashi Mare dynasty, who established themselves in the Outer Rim as a center of dark worship. They became enamored with strange artifacts and dark side knowledge, and worshipped the images of the Bedlam spirits that they had. They conducted ceremonies and rituals in hopes of summoning Sine, but of course, he laughed. He mocked their devotion to him. He found it amusing more than flattering. The earliest secret societies and cults would emerge from the Kashi Mare, who sent out delegates to other worlds in order to infiltrate governments and establish hidden factions with like-minded individuals. The earliest Darkside cult. According to the legend, there are many stories that could be told during this war, as there are stars in the galaxy, but they have almost all been long forgotten to this era, or any modern existence of Star Wars that we know. The The evidence of these struggles remain even in the modern galaxy, however. For instance, the brass soldiers of Uxum remains one of the 20 wonders of the galaxy. The 35,000 soldiers on Uxum had been winning a war against the vicious species known as the Tulveri, who had recently conquered the world of She-Ra when a Darkseid cult arrived. The cult turned all of the soldiers to brass using Darkseid magic, energy from the ancient world. Typhogem himself is responsible for having caused the catastrophe on Geonosis, who were the ancestral race of the Geonosians, were battling the hordes of the Theragorgot. Tens of thousands of insectoid soldiers surged that once moist green planet. It is believed that Typhogem himself viewed his sister's vast armies as a threat to his own sovereignty, and in order to decimate her larger forces, his servants were secretly instructed to redirect a comet out of its trajectory to collide with the planet's largest moon. The Cataclysm fallout wiped out huge numbers on both sides, leaving the world the arid and burnt desert that we know today as Geonosis. One of the most amazing stories that happens during this time is the species of the Muab. The Muab, despite being hit with a superweapon, had always remained loyal to the Celestials, and when the Cataclysm rained down upon them, they were removed by the Celestials to their hidden realm. When this happened, this long-puzzled Typhogem, who then sought answers to this mystery, but never discovered the true reason. It's never explicitly stated in the book or anywhere, but we at the archives have assumed that the Sith purebloods likely came into the galaxy somewhere around this time, since they know who Typhogem is, and have him as a part of their pantheon of gods. We believe that maybe very early on, Typhogem came across the Sith purebloods and recruited them into his infernal army. Despite the Shroud of Darkness having fallen upon the galaxy, the Firstborn and their offspring races proved hard to subjugate and even harder to kill. As the war expanded, many determined to keep their people spread out on different worlds so that they could not so easily be wiped out. Others resolved to fight until the very last man and the very last breath and member of their race, and so joined forces with allies across the stars. This, at least in some way, brought back camaraderie to the Sky River galaxy that had once been lost. The Wookiees now entered the war, offering their strength on behalf of the galaxy, and with them, even the gargantuan monsters that seemed mindless could sense that there were things in their home that did not belong. The denizens of other space found themselves fighting against such creatures as dragon slugs, rancors, and even armies of Zillo beasts. Finally, the beings of the galaxy were able to rally under one cause and forge an official alliance. Led by the coalition of Firstborns, they were able to quickly recover from the initial assault wave and coordinated a genius plan of defense and counterattack. Using technology, the Na'vi species would send giant sea creatures into the aquatic planets of the galaxy to fight on their behalf in the sea. This would include beasts that we recognize, such as the Sando aqua monster on Naboo. The Kalai would respond by sending flocks of fierce avians to dominate the skies of worlds. To combat the deadly races of shapeshifters which could infiltrate and deceive their ranks, the Firstborn dispatched teams of naturally telepathic races, such as the Iktachi, to sniff out the imposters and to hunt them down. Others put their technological prowess to work, such as the Lucent, who spun advanced defense metrics and protected entire sectors of space. The Zazaks worked alongside the Lucent and spread their technology around the western quadrant of the galaxy. It was there where the fighting was at its worst, and the Gree developed advanced artificial intelligence in order to fight the war, creating the first tactical minds and battle droids which would serve both their own enclave as well as venture out and fight for other systems. The Sephi, in turn, used their incredible powers as the Firstborn to repel invading forces, as they could use the Force, and using the Force was able to catch their enemy by surprise, such as the Ungti monks. Back in this day, the only real way to get around was either through hypergates or through infinity gates, so they were well watched by all worlds. But the Ang-Ti could use their fold space technique in order to instantaneously transport ships around space in order to rescue those under attack. And the Kuru, they built teleportation devices across the galaxy, aiding in their endeavor. Other races served in different ways, such as the Diatham. They served as healers, prophets, imparting the will of the Force upon travelers. Their actions were what saved most lives during this dreadful time, seeking out those that were lost or injured. Some species, however, only sought to preserve themselves, and did not feel that they could lend any aid. This was the case with the Sharu, who built massive plastic pyramids with which to hide themselves. Beneath these pyramids, they constructed a tool known as the Mind Harp. This was placed within one of their sacred temples, and whenever any future civilization activated the Mind Harp, it would release a signal that would let the Sharu know that it was finally safe to emerge. And so, they almost all but vanished from the galaxy. Despite all these valiant stratagems from the Firstborn and their offspring, the Hellions of the Dark World were not so easily deterred. Towering titans descended upon the plains and walked through cities, destroying whatever was in their path. Hordes of mad, amorphous creatures frolicked in the wilds to lick up the blood of anything they decided was their prey. Shadow beings summoned by Typhogem prowled the dreams, fed on the sanity of the galaxy itself. His brother, the vampiric Oradrill, terrorized the skies, ravaging at will alongside his brood of clones. Unbound by the limitation of things like gravity, they fed on all they desired, feasting upon the flesh of the populace of the galaxy as if they were cattle. And with these overlords of darkness came their vicious armies and infernal machines of death, fire, and war. The Force itself cried out in horror and pain during this long era. Many of the Firstborn came to severely regret not heeding the words of the Celestials from long ago, for now that they had withdrawn, their loss was seen as truly grievous. The full weight of their choices had come crashing down as death showed its true form, not only in violent attack, but through illness, and even coming in the form of growing old. Into the fray of war came also germs, viruses, parasites, pathogenic bacteria, that caused even greater suffering, more loss of life than any single enemy. The war lasted a total of 982 years, a time of suffering never seen on quite a scale before, and that we have never seen in the lore after. But the Celestials had not given up entirely on their beloved galaxy, and their compassion burned brightly for the Sky River. And as the wars finally began to wane with the denizens of the galaxy coming out victorious, the Old Ones, the Celestials, would clash in their own unseen way, beginning the next phase, known as the Cosmic Wars. What happened to the Celestials? Chapter 4: The War of the Temporal Planes. During this time, we'll go back to Typhogem. Typhogem discovered that the Gree hypergates could be reconfigured to have their massive engines harnessed to pierce an opening through the confines of space-time itself. He wanted to create a tunnel into other dimensions, and he believed that this technology could do it. This effectively would make them become trans-dimensional gods without the assistance of Splendid App or any of the other Bedlam spirits. This would then allow the Old Ones to infiltrate and control all of the temporal planes of existence. Typhogem even had his theories that this is how the Muab escaped, answering his near 1,000-year-old conundrum. However, he did not know how to transform the Hypergate's energy himself, and to him, the Gree were one of his greatest enemies, who would die before giving up their secrets. But Typhogem's sorcerers who studied the mysteries of the dark side told him that there was another way to use the gate, a gem that they believed had the properties needed to harness their energies. It was the Shadow Stone, the Thieragorigot. With it, they could force open a door into other places and rule over all spheres of existence, perhaps even the provinces of the Celestials themselves. Typhogem was gearing for war on a new cosmic level. But the Insect Queen had spies among her brother's ranks, and determined that his rule would not suit her plans. And now, she had come to suspect his role in the destruction of the armies of Geonosis. She ordered her own sorcerers, known as the Wizards of the Night Spirit, to take the Shadow Stone and conceal themselves where Typhogem's forces could not locate them. But yet another problem would arrive in both of their plans. Word of the enemy's intent to use the hypergates to pierce the dimensional veil arrived to the ears of the scientist priests known as the Seal 5. In response, they developed a crystal-based plasma cannon to quickly destroy the gates so that Typhogem and his sister could not access them. During this time, the priests had been working on how to look into the alternate dimension, the Dark Dimension. They reasoned that if they could seal away the doors of other space, then the universe would not have to suffocate under their eternal darkness, and that if they could close the gate, that the war would end. Aided by the Gree, this had been the Seolians' plan, and only work up until this point, to stop the demons of other space. But now they had a new work, producing and exporting vast quantities of the plasma cannons to numerous worlds by the means of a secret network. Typhogem's spies reported these schemes back to him, and the Titan overlords sentenced the Seolans to extermination for their crime. He could not, however, figure out who the secret network was and who was distributing the weapons across the galaxy. In a matter of days, the members of Seol 5 had located and destroyed the hidden star temple that housed the Infinity Gate, stopping any surprise attack. What they did not count on, though, was an enemy fleet arriving, flying in from the neighboring planet of Seol 6. From there came the Legion of Stednax, flying creatures mutated with the Skytree that Telotni had created long ago as instruments of war. And with these flying enemies, the terrifying, multi-tentacled horror known as the Ladekek, which would later become known as the Terror from Beyond. Having figured out early on what the enemy would seek, the Seolans had just long enough to move their primary base and labs underground to a city that they had constructed long ago during the early days of the war to hide away. These scientists had been predicting a calamity all the way back when the humans were causing problems on Coruscant, and so they had been preparing for eons on end. They had cleverly hid the entrance of their impenetrable underground city beneath the statue of Onrai. The Stenax, creations of Telotni, who still worshipped her, did not dare desecrate an edifice of their goddess, and so left it alone while they performed their raid on the world. The beasts ravaged the cities and the countryside in search of them, killing as many as they could. But still, they could not locate their subterranean labs. Content that the Seolans could no longer prove any logical threat, the Ladekek propelled themselves through the stars in search of other prey, leaving the Seolans alone. The hidden Seolans never saw the surface of their world again, however, and it is for this reason that the Ladekek is called the Terror from Beyond, for the fear that he inspired caused the Seolans to choose a life underground, where their descendants remain forever, avoiding any and all outsiders. The secret network that Typhlosion could not discover was in fact the Kwa. It was the Kwa who were fulfilling their oath to make up for the terrible things that had happened a millennium prior because of their Infinity Gate technology. The Kwa had long regretted placing trust in Telotni's lies, and had waited for this very opportunity to atone for their sin. The Kwa pretended to continually serve the Old Ones, while transferring the newly developed plasma cannons to various systems across the stars. The plan was for the inhabitants to use them to destroy the hypergates on each of their worlds. The Firstborn sent out numerous teams to systematically travel to the deep core and then outward, finding every inhabited world that still had a hypergate. This became known as the War of Temporal Planes, and many stories and wars could be told of the brave heroes who risked torture and death on numerous planets to destroy the means by which the Old Ones could rule and travel the universe. However, not everyone was pleased with this new development and the destruction of the hypergates. The destruction of their hypergates aggravated the Gree, who had once constructed these things for noble and necessary purposes of travel and communication. And so, they stubbornly kept theirs secret, which they put under heavy guard. In their eyes, it was the Quath Infinity Gates that they deemed as the real threat, not only because they could be used as superweapons, but also because this was the primary means by which the invasion forces had traveled and inhabited worlds in the galaxy. The Gree brought this matter before the Council of the Firstborn, but it was argued that while many Infinity Gates had been destroyed, they could not eliminate all of them, for they were yet needed by numerous systems in order to escape, and even prevent attacks. It was even argued that they could be used to bring the fight to enemies on their own worlds, using them as a weapon of offense instead of defense. The carnage of the Empyrene Wars had taken a heavy toll on the population of the galaxy, in an eruption of fire and blood. A great outcry rose up from many of the regretful Firstborn, as well as their offspring after the war. They utilized the 10-story tower of the Oracle of Pelgrin to send out a distress signal, using the Force to do so, asking for help from their ancient celestial friends and guardians, begging for their return. Very few remained hopeful that their former guardians would ever answer the call, but the plea was indeed heard. The Celestials sent out a vision to the Firstborn, who would then pass it down to their faithful offspring. This is a promise to all of the extant races, who all turn back from the darkest will to find again the light, and in the fields of tomorrow be given the inheritance robbed of them by the false architects and the monsters that they have brought into being. But the choices that have been made cannot be unmade, nor their consequences removed, for all have been warned by us against the lures of Onrai, and now the galaxy has been forever changed. All but a handful of the Firstborn had now abandoned their former ways of violence and hatred. The faithful Pelgrin requested to depart the galaxy for the domain of the Celestials, and they were eventually granted this request by the Firstborn. Many of the other firstborn species would follow suit, and this is why so many of the ancient races of the galaxy have seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving little behind but the amazing wonders that they created. The Celestials, meanwhile, had long searched for the Dark Dimension, attempting to find the realm which had brought so much pain upon the Sky-Rivered galaxy. But when they were summoned by the Firstborn, the Celestials did indeed return, aggrieved to find the galaxy that they had created in ruin. Out of their love for their offspring though, the Celestials conceded to remove the catalyst of evil from this realm, and they drove the old ones out. And so the Celestials sent forth a champion from their ranks, the one who may have been responsible for it from the very beginning. The champion the Celestials selected was Watsek, the father of the Bedlam spirits. And so we reach chapter 5. The Judgment of the Dark Ones. Telotni had departed the Dark Dimension for unfathomed worlds beyond within the deep core. It is here where she sought the hidden world from which the midichlorians would first spread into the galaxy. Telotni sought to find the wellspring of the Force. She was, however, unable to locate it, because of the fact that the Wills kept the Force from her. Instead, she found a safe nebula within the deep core. For all of the Empyrean Wars, and in so many centuries that would follow, Telotni had been preparing a new brood of children within her. She intended for this new offspring to be beautiful and crafty, unlike the monstrous horrors that she begat in the earlier day. The Force, though, reached out to Watsek, her father, leading him to the hidden nebula, where Telotni awaited the delivery. Finally, after ages upon ages, Watsek and Telotni would speak again. His first words to her were this: "I am your maker, and the one who first shaped you, and above me is the one who shaped me. Though I have done you a terrible wrong, I reach out to you now, for you have the power to reverse the evil that you have done, and restore things to how they should be. Do this, and you will be given new gifts and new life." Telotni, though, still broken and twisted, said this: "I am my own maker, Force Demon. You would do well to see that I do not use my power to unmake you." Watsek, though, cleverly decided to pounce on this, challenging her, saying that if this was true, then there should be nothing that she could not do, nothing that she could not achieve. Watsek then says that she has proven that she can shape the most beautiful of forms, but she has no mastery of that which is ugliest and loathsome, that they rule beyond her. Because of this, he believed that she was good, a good shaper, intending to stoke her pride in this moment. Watsek said that he doesn't believe that she was capable of being one who birthed the ugly things that had invaded the galaxy. And here, he successfully brought about her arrogance, and Telotni spoke again. "The monstrosities of which you speak are not of my creation, for I was deceived. Nevertheless, to prove to you that Telotni is all-powerful and the maker of all things, I will show you what I can do before I depart." And at that, she transformed herself into a giant spider-like roach. But as revolting as the creature was, Watsek perceived it could be dangerous and spoke again. Watsek said that the creature was not so ugly, since it was furtive and hardy, and therefore beautiful in its own unique way. So Telotni reshaped herself a second time, now into the form of a mazefly. But as nasty as the creature was, Watsek knew that it was fast and could easily spread contagion, so he challenged her again, saying this: "This is not so very ugly, for this creature is useful in the decomposition of biological organisms, thus it is rather attractive in its own way." With this, Telotni spiraled into a rage. She shaped herself into 100 hideous forms in the blink of an eye, settling on the one she thought was the most ugly. The image was based on a putrid carrion worm. Telotni had seen this creature many times in other space, but as she augmented its shape and designed it into a parasitic repugnancy unlike any other, Watsek saw that it was sluggish, slow, and fearful of sunlight, and he congratulated Telotni. "Indeed, you have invented the most hideous of shapes. You have given it groping tentacles and a dozen maleficent eyes, and in its rear, numerous squirming feelers. It carries the death of stench, for it is a thing born of long-dead corpses, a feeder on the life force and the echoes of all that is ill and misbegotten. It is this shape that you will keep, and the form in which you will finish out your days, for I am your maker. But you have remade yourself into an image far more fitting of your character. You will still produce offspring. Indeed, the seed of many have grown and are ready to emerge, but these will be like you are now, and will seek to devour you if they can, because just like you, they can stand no rival. Is this not fitting justice for all the countless evils that you have wrought upon the galaxy?" Hearing this, Telotni panicked, attempting to transform back into her more beautiful form, but found that she now could not. Watsek had outsmarted her, used his power to lock her in this hideous, rancid form. Fear engulfed Telotni completely, as she recognized that her powers had also been taken, crushed into dust along with her beauty. Watsek's glow then dimmed into sadness, as he still remembered that he had been her maker, and even though she was now twisted and evil, he did not take pleasure in her defeat. Telotni, hear me. I can undo this. It is because of your fear of me that you first made yourself into an object to be feared. You once loved beauty, though the things you wrought were ugly and hateful. But you can choose love again. Aid us in restoring the worlds to their former course before you wrought your horror upon them. Return beauty to the universe, and you will have earned back your former shape. Telotni paused for a moment to consider his words, but far too long had the thoughts been bitterly dwelled. They had become foul, hateful, perverse. Kindness and mercy were completely foreign to her. Instead of taking his offer of compassion, she clung to her hatred, cursing at him again, prophesying that he would one day feel as trapped and helpless as she did now. A prophecy which would come to fulfillment when Watsek would be trapped in a crystal prison by the Cult of the Five and labeled forever as a Force demon. Angered and saddened by this, Watsek said, "Then Telotni is no more. You are now called El Shudem, the Soul Worm, since you have called upon the Void, and it is in the Void that you will dwell in solitude. You will writhe and hunger until the end of your days, when in despair, you ultimately have devoured yourself." Upon saying this, Watsek moved on. The Soul Worm shuddered, recalling the prophetic poem of Nol Nol that was recited to her at his birth, speaking to her end. No longer able to stand the pain of her loss or endure what she had become, Telotni began to spin around to catch her tail in her mouth so that she may consume herself and finally die. In Telotni's final moments, the Soul Worm, she would give birth to a myriad of foul and disgusting creatures, burrowing their way out of her to escape into the vastness of space, becoming receptacles of the dark side. Watsek, following the trails of this horrid army and having heard the name of the dark other dimension, found the rifts and entered other space. When he entered Eothurion, there, he approached Koldana Sene, who had witnessed the events of the cosmos unfold. Watsek stated to Sene the exact thing that he had said to Telotni, that he was his maker, and above him was the one who had shaped him. The celestial Watsek said that although Sene had done terrible things, that Watsek was now reaching out to him to reverse this evil, and wanted to impart upon the Bedlam spirit gifts of life. But Koldana Sene was no longer how he once was, no longer vibrant, full of laughter, no longer filled with excitement, even at the prospect of doing twisted and vile things. He now found everything to be very dull, including the prospect of reversing what he had created, and he had entered into a deep melancholy, one which he had deepened, and he had felt the death of his sister. Though he had loathed Telotni, he still now found himself missing her, as he had once missed Horlus, his brother. His creator Watsek took responsibility for Sene's current state, but asked him why he spoke with such sadness. Sene responded warily, "There is no pleasure left for me, for I have seen and done all. For all that is novel at first becomes tiresome. All that is young and new becomes old and decrepit. All that promises fascination grows toilsome. All ends in death, and futility lies at its heart. Would that I reversed my reversions, as you wish, restored all the light and the splendor? The light will only again grow dim. The splendor will but turn to rust and ash. All that has happened will happen again, in endless cycles, with lessening glory than at first. For that is the way of the worlds." Watsek told him that he indeed discovered the truth of the mortal plane, but that his son Sene had not been there at the beginning when they had danced to harmonious joy, to creation and love. It was something that Watsek promised that he could show him again, but Sene was silent for a moment, bitterly muttering that if Watsek was his maker, then he should simply reverse time to start anew, completely obliterate him. But they did not. Watsek responded with this, "I have not given you that which I should have, but I come now with a challenge that may please you. You have been a master of the anti-concept, but the final one yet remains, the ultimate contradiction, a paradox that you have not yet attained, and the final new thing. For you know that you are immortal, and yet now exist as one who is dead. If you are able, you should die that you may come back to life." Sine considered his thought, and for a moment, his crimson face aligned in realization that this was the final paradox. From the earliest moment of his life, death was the first thing that he knew and conceived. Perhaps Sine, in his final moments of death, he may finally get to know life. And so as he said that he was supposed to, that it was good that Wotsak was with him here at the end, Sine was filled with a sense of happiness. His father, his created, had abandoned him at birth, but he would stand with him in death. Sine even asked Wotsak for assistance in dying, so with the aid of the Celestial, Sine's body collapsed into itself, becoming a storming vortex, deadly forces writhing together, raging energies of chaos, enigma, antithesis. Wotsak was again saddened by the death of another child, but he found solace in knowing that in time, his inversion will again reverse to create life once again. Trembling at the power of Wotsak and the death of Sine, the spawn of the Bedlam spirits fled in terror. The Celestial was too powerful, and they feared that they would be destroyed soon too. Typhogem was one that hesitated. Across the vast expanse of space, he stared at Wotsak with unspeakable, unyielding rage. From that moment forth, Typhogem sought nothing but Wotsak's death and destruction. Yet for the time, he too passed on through the open doorways, retreating deep into other space. The Celestial's champion was too strong. This left behind only Splendid App, who was curious about his creator in Wotsak. He remembered him from so long ago. Wotsak would tenderly approach Splendid, and repeated to him the introduction of the message of receiving gifts and life. Splendid App, feeling a sudden insight, said in the language that few besides his maker could understand. He repeated this: "I recollect that you were also the one who sought to unmake us. Though it has taken me long to understand why, you well know that I had the power to reverse all that he had done and restore all to how it was before. For I had been a master of time and space. But I did not do this because I estimated at last that to do so would be to violate universal laws, which I intuit is unwise, though I do not fully apprehend why that may be." Wotsak responded that his child had spoken wisely, and so he took him before the Supreme Maker directly, who taught Splendid App the wisdom, compassion, justice, as well as the balance and power that the other Celestials had received in the very first days of creation. The Bedlam spirit did not discern good or evil at the time, and was entrusted with a great task, one which would make special use of his talent. And with this, ended the Bedlam spirits as we knew them. The arrival of Wotsak had ended the Empyrene Wars, and thus brought this era to a close. But back to Typhogem. His plan for total existence domination were officially put on indefinite hold with the arrival of Wotsak. All of the hypergates had been destroyed save for one, which was too heavily guarded. But Typhogem's focus had completely shifted. Sine had been the one being in all of the universe that he felt any sort of affection towards. And now he was gone, murdered because of Wotsak, his twisted grandfather. However, Typhogem was what we would like to call a third-generation Celestial. He was born from beings created by a Celestial. The point is, he wasn't powerful enough on his own to actually do anything to Wotsak, at least not yet. So Typhogem decided to rally his insectoid sister once again, to strike a bargain with her. The Shadow Stone would be his key to revenge over Wotsak, but Typhogem needed the approval of his sister in order to wield it successfully. But the Theragorgot did not trust him. He was too power hungry. Having said that though, Typhogem's sister too wanted revenge in honor of Sine and his death, and so she relinquished the Shadow Stone to Typhogem, but her spies would follow him closely. Typhogem was of course fully aware of this, but he found it counterintuitive to provoke an eternal war with his sibling, so he resisted the temptation to keep the gem for himself. Typhogem would take this jewel into the swirling vortex of what was left behind of his father, and among the Shadow Stone's many powers was the protection it gave against destructive forces. And with this, Typhogem safely descended into the raging whirlwind that was once his father and creator. Braving the crushing forces that stormed there, he hurled into the vortex, where the greatest pressures were exerted, a rare and a precious gem he had carved out of the core of the planet. Upon this gem, Typhogem cast dark spells, infused it with sorcery. The pull of the magnetic fields focused on the enchanted gem so that the jewel transferred and absorbed those properties into itself. And now, Typho Gem's secret weapon was ready and forged. He would travel to a well-populated world in a triangular ship that could pass between other space and real space at whim. There, he unleashed his armies to slaughter every living being. This eventually caught the attention of the celestial guardian Wutsek, who believed that he had already dealt with the old ones, that they had fled from his very presence. When Wutsek arrived, however, the trap was sprung. In the sight of all, Typho Gem raised the magnetic gem with his left hand, sucking the body of Wutsek into it, and trapping his grandfather inside. Typho Gem raised as being a being more powerful than the Celestials, and from that point forward, Typho Gem was referred to as the left-handed god. We believe that the Sith purebloods were present for this battle, as they call Typho Gem the left-handed god in all of their pantheon and writings. Now at this point, there is a bit of confusing continuity of what happens next. According to Supernatural Encounters, Typho Gem then kills Wutsek by infusing his dark power in the gem and reducing the Celestial to ashes. But we know that this isn't possible because Wutsek is still trapped in the gem by the time of 0 BBY. This is when the Cult of the Five have him as part of their collection. So as stated earlier, we are defaulting to official Legends continuity for this source, leading us to believe that instead, Typho Gem kept Wutsek trapped, hid him away in the triangular ship that the Cult of the Five would later come to possess. And that is how they eventually gained Wutsek. He did not die here. Now with the Celestial Champion defeated though, and out of the way, Typho Gem moved on his plans for galactic domination, beginning with enslaving the humans on Coruscant. His plans were successful, and he placed them under the rule of one of his wicked generals. Many of the humans though rejected their prideful ways, and they had embraced goodness and the light, desiring not to cause harm in the name of any more false gods. Many humans started a rebellion against the lieutenant of Typho Gem, and they nearly succeeded. This wasn't until an unexpected ally would appear out of a realm of the Celestials, someone who had not been heard of for eons, none other than one of the Bedlam spirits, Horlus, the last of the spirits that still remained. Horlus had long before journeyed to the domain of the Celestials, and it was there where he had been transfigured. With the capture of Wutsek, he re-emerged as a glorious being who now led the Firstborn Remnant against the tenebrous hordes of the insidious Old Ones. In the Dark Dimension, Horlus soared as a great and a terrifying light, reaching out into all of the minds who dwelt in this dark, evil place. He promised that any who would now reject the darkness would be reborn into the light. And at his call, many of the night creatures, great, small, they all actually came out of the shadow, as did the victims of the failed experiments of the other spirits, any who wished to escape the hellish realm of terror. Horlus proved true to his word, transporting all of them into worlds in real space suitable for all of their needs. To the rest of them who would not emerge from the shadow though, he issued a warning. Should any ever depart the darkness of their realm, he would return and exact a grave vengeance. He knew all of these places, how to scare the creatures of other space because of the transformation given to him by the redeemed Splendid app. Horlus was now on the level of the Celestials. He then ventured to Coruscant, and with a single stroke, beheaded the powerful lieutenant of Typho Gem, freeing the human race. At this decisive motion, the hordes of terrible creatures withdrew into deep darkness. The Insect Queen constructed an alien web around herself, holding to the Dark Dimension to hide from the returned entity. Even the offspring of Telotni Uradril and his brood slinked away into hiding so that they would not be destroyed. At this, Horlus turned his sights to Typho Gem and called out the name that Telotni had originally given him at birth, a horrid name that had long been forgotten to everyone else, never to be uttered again. This single name was enough to provoke Typho Gem and his army into journeying to the core, where Horlus awaited. Typho Gem was armed with the enchanted gem which had defeated Wutsek, and he attempted to trap his uncle who had dared to challenge him. As he flew to annihilate his enemy, Horlus created a black hole in space, in which he set a trap of his own for Typho Gem. As Typho Gem approached, all of his terrifying power come to bear. Horlus utilized the gem in the dark entity's own hand to create a maelstrom. Horlus then flew off to face Typho Gem personally, echoing out concentrated waves of pure light side energy so brilliant that it lit up the infinite darkness of space like a blazing sun. Typho Gem would neither flee nor give in to the forces tearing at him though. but instead, he pushed towards his uncle, intent on his destruction. But Typhlogem's body was not as strong as his will. He began to be pulled apart by all of the powers against him, and at last, he let out a final agonizing wail that shattered a neighboring moon. Typhlogem's body splintered into pieces, which then stiffened into petrification before being sucked into the black hole created by Horlus. Parts of Typhogem were hurled into odd regions of the galaxy. His soul, however, was cast into the deep pit of chaos, where all beings of the dark side would go when they die. Fear was now lit within the evil multitude, for they discerned the great power of this being who could kill one of the old ones, and so those that could scurried back to the dead worlds of other space. At long, tiring last, the beings of the galaxy could say farewell to the hellspawn of the dark otherworld, saying goodbye to Illithurion. And now, 764 years after the very beginning, the War of Temporal Planes came to an official end, appropriately with the destruction of a Sith god. And now we have entered Part 4, which we have titled A New Age. Chapter 1, Cleanup. Needless to say, the western side of the galaxy was in near total ruin following the war. A series of wars that spanned an accumulated 1700 years had completely devastated many planetary systems, especially those that were directly fought upon. This area, which became known as the Unknown Regions, would be sanctioned off by the Celestials. They needed it to remain inaccessible, for Nol Nol still remained somewhere out there in the deep expanses of space, and the Celestials themselves could not locate it. Not only this, but the dark forces which had served the old ones didn't make it back to other space. Many of them had made these worlds their home, and the Celestials knew that in time, the residents of the galaxy would learn to travel the stars yet again, but not through gates like yesteryear, but now through ships. This had actually been the reason that hyperspace had been created at the very beginning of it all. So in order to discourage and frustrate exploration of the unknown regions, the Celestials tangled up the hyperlanes leading towards that area of space. And to this day, the Unknown Regions remains a place of strange anomalies that echo with the beings and the power of the primordial era from whence it came. It was Horlus that aided in the removal of the remaining Gree hypergates, just in case. Now all that remained of them were the standing arches of the Gree Enclave. They are the few that preserved in honor and memory of the galactic bond once shared in better times. However, their secrets were long ago lost due to the Gree Elders, who agreed not to pass them on. The Infinity Gates were left standing, however, as transportation was yet needed for refugees and others to return to their worlds following the war. But luckily, the gates were altered so that they could not be used as superweapons save by the Qua, who were entrusted with the secrets in the events that the old ones would one day return. Also during this time, nearly all of the gates where the Dark Dimension was open were now closed, concealed, or forgotten. And in the Grand Assembly of the Celestials, Luxos was the one that suggested that the Wellspring of the Force should be protected by a Guardian. This was the Shaman of the Wills, also known as the creation of the Force Priestesses. Along with them, the Celestials too would continue to play a role in the lives of those that they had created, enabling them to defend themselves in the event of the return of the Dark Forces, or war. All of them agreed, but the means by which they could do this remained a challenge, as they could not create weapons of war that could be misused to dominate or harm. The Killik species knew of a way to aid in this, and with the help of the Celestials and others among the firstborn races, they brought about the creation of many wonders that still remain in the galaxy today. What's crazy is we don't know what all of these objects do, as their purpose and use has either been lost to time or is a very well kept secret. These wonders served various purposes back in this era though, but could mainly be used as a defense against the return of the Ones. Their secret to their workings were either shared with only a few trusted beings in each sector, who was not allowed to share their function with anyone, and these were passed on to their offspring. But since they were semi-sentient constructs, they could only be wielded by ones who proved to be peace-loving and wise. But of the ones that we could uncover, these were the mechanical marvels which the ancients constructed. The first was the Siritu spheres, 6 round objects which orbited the star of Siritu in the expansion region. They were comprised of rock and iron, and each sphere was honeycombed with twisted tunnels. It was rumored that some scouts who had been ventured into the spheres discovered wondrous machinery, while others were mysteriously altered by the process and could no longer remember. Some scouts were said to have never returned at all. The second creation was the Aru Diamond. two giant spherical diamonds the size of planets, which were situated in the Hour system. Eventually, they became known as the Hour 9 and the Hour 10, since they occupied the 9th and the 10th planetary position in the star system. The 11th orbital position, however, was simply a cloud of diamond fragments, possibly indicating that there had once been a third diamond that, for some lost reason to time, shattered. The next was the Quintatad, 5 artificial stars which orbited one another located in the void of Arygos. The fourth was the Diatane Clockwork, a ring structure made of an unknown alloy and whose job it was to encircle and to power a nearby star, which was situated right on the edge of the deep core. Following this, you have the Eonane. This was a ring amid the tangle of hyperspace anomalies that made up the barrier of the unknown regions, and they sit in this Eonane system. The third planet in the system is nearly as bright as its star is, and for ages was wrongly identified as a stellar companion. But its brightness is a product of the sunlight reflecting off of hundreds of meters of glass sand that encase the planet's surface. This sand whips through the planet's atmosphere in monstrous storms of razor-sharp particles. The planet is surrounded by the ruins of an orbital ring, but its surface features have been reduced to ash. The next construction is the Cosmic Turbine, one of the more well-known. It was a set of similar massive machines located in the Voltar system. The Cosmic Turbine itself was an immense device capable of manipulating gravity on a large scale. In fact, the Cosmic Turbine was responsible for the creation of the Voltar system, as the Celestials and the Firstborn used it to pull together planets and stars in order to create an entirely new system for the inhabitants. Then there was the rest, which are named, but we don't have any information on their function, that being the Malabar Construct, the Still Curtain, and the Chasm of Forever. The most famous of all of the Celestials' constructs, though, would perhaps be Centerpoint Station, which the Killiks referred to as the World Puller. Centerpoint Station was created when many humans wanted to depart and leave Coruscant, as they felt that their leadership continued to be a festering nest of power-hungry individuals, those who were vying for power amidst the vacuum created following the war. The remnant of the Coruscant rebels that had fought back against the rule of Typhojam's lieutenant petitioned for Horliss to obtain them a brand new world in which to inhabit, one which was independent from the political intrigue of Coruscant. The Killiks offered in return to assist in this endeavor, asking that Horliss aid them in the final part of the construction of an elaborate and enormous space station that would act both as a protective force field and a tractor beam. Centerpoint Station then took 3 uninhabited moons, as well as planets from the Coruscant system, and transported them through hyperspace to the empty sector within the core. 2 other lifeless worlds, indigenous to this new system, were placed in this brand new orbit. The system became known as the Five Brother. The Sons of Freedom were brought to live on one of the worlds here, which they renamed after one of their heroes, Corellia. Refugees from the wars were sent to Coruscant and other core planets, making this the great melting pot of cultures that we know the galaxy to be today. But one of the last gifts given by the Celestials would be perhaps the most important. The Celestials had seen to it that through a bloodline of random selection, some would be born with a greater number of midichlorians than others, a gift that would enable them to tap into the life force of the universe, or the cosmic force, and through the life force within, the living force, all is guided by the wills of the force, and thus, the lost lineage and heritage of the Firstborn might in part be reclaimed. Amidst all of this, there were 3 very specific Celestials who were feeling the call to linger behind and stay in the realm of the galaxy, as their duty as guides to sentient beings remained steadfast in their hearts, which at long last brings us to one of our most important chapters. Chapter 2, The Ones. The Council of the 7 Celestials convened once more. This would be for the final time, and among their ranks voiced a great desire of his. Elagast knew that they could not serve as guides to other races who had intentionally severed themselves from the Celestials, telling the Council that many races had rejected the 4 precepts. The universe was doomed to repeat a cycle of war for all time, until there came a distant future event of divine restoration. Elagast, feeling strongly about his role as a guide, determined that he would personally lead them, but not as a Celestial, since it was impossible to remain among a fallen people in his celestial form. In response, he would incarnate himself as a human, one who retained the wisdom and power of the Celestials. Alongside with him would come 2 others, Ifa and Nightfall. Each of them would take on a representation of the 4 precepts of Ifa, who would go on to become the sun, to embody power, and Nightfall, who would become the daughter, to embody wisdom. Elagast, who would be the father of them both, would embody the concept of justice, to maintain balance. They determined that the Force itself would be the one to embody love. The chief of the Celestials, Luxos, cautioned them that they would be in danger that they could fall to darkness, since that they would be in human form. Another Celestial, Marutz, warned that this could prove to be far more taxing on them than they first realized, and they might lose something of themselves along this path. And the Celestial Zurs reminded them that they had not been made to endure long suffering and violence, telling them that this is why they left the Prime Universe in the first place. This was an extremely risky task and decision, and so the 7 brought it before the Supreme Maker directly, who would let them know the future. Although Elagast would maintain balance for years, he would eventually fail to choose compassion, upon which everything else was built. One such is they could only endure the trials of being human in a mortal galaxy for so long. Even though they were immortal, their resolve would weaken them in this state, and when that happened, everything he loved would begin to perish and crumble away. And upon that event, a chosen one should be raised up to replace him. The Celestials wouldn't be doing their job if they didn't express concern about the event of this chosen one, and if that should also fail. But the newly elected Celestial Horlus reminded them of a prophecy which promised restoration of all things that would come later. One would arise from among them, and they then recited a portion from the writings of the Order of the Wills. The writing said this: "In the time of greatest despair, there shall come a Savior, and he shall be known as the Son of Sons, and in the ages beyond, the world will be remade, as in the splendor of the earliest days, and they will never again feel sorrow nor harm." After this, the Celestials then went forth and created a hidden world in a pocket dimension. This jungle planet was full of power in the Force, and into this place from the wellspring of balance, Elagast incarnated into his human form. From the pool of knowledge, Nightfall was incarnated as the daughter, and from the font of power, Ifa was incarnated as the sun. And from what we understand, this was before the fountain came to be tainted with the powers of the dark side, creating a dark energy. Later on though, the Mindwalkers referred to the font of power as being tainted by the dark side. This perhaps tells us that it wasn't originally this way, and that the sun was not originally evil. Supernatural Encounters is unfortunately silent on the original state of the font of power though. But from what we have gathered, neither the font of power nor the pool of knowledge had yet to become diametrically opposed nexuses in the Force. They were neither light nor dark yet. They didn't represent light or dark, they were simply empowered by the concepts that they represented, that being knowledge and power. You see, the ones were technically mortal, and the key to remaining alive for so long, they would draw their power from these 3 nexuses of energy: the wellspring of balance, the font of power, and the pool of knowledge. These were maintained to ensure that he and his offspring would, in their mortal bodies, remain alive for ages. For although great time would pass differently in the other world, still, time would pass. These 3 became known as the Ones, and they appeared to the galaxy after the War of Temporal Planes and announced themselves, calling themselves the True Architects. They had come to help rebuild, to restore. They took on the names of family members so that they could present themselves in a way that the galaxy could understand. And so, very likely from this point forward, the only ones to refer to them by their real names were one another. He reiterated the principles of the 4 precepts that all beings were to follow and obey, and yet the father of Mortis knew that he could not lead them all alone. He knew that the galaxy was too large to help assist in guiding all of the people and all of the Force sensitives. The father knew that he would need the help of those that could touch the Force, as the Celestials had predetermined. It would be the task of these Force sensitives to guide and to listen to the will of the Force. And to this end, the Ones and the Celestials, aided by the Qua, would construct the pyramidal-shaped Tho-Yor ships, vessels of great power and influence. And then, at an unknown point in history, the 9 Tho-Yor would traverse across the galaxy to collect all of the Force sensitives from as many worlds as they could reach and locate as many races and people as possible to convene in one sacred place where they would become fellow guardians and protectors of balance. The beginning of the Jedi. But in the passage of time, the father came to see exactly what the Supreme Maker meant with his grand warning. For as the turbulence of the galaxy swung towards war, so too would his son and daughter become sorely affected. And the father put forth a saying into the galaxy at this time that explained the 4 precepts. Love without power, and wisdom is hypocrisy and sentiment. Power without love and wisdom is foolishness and violence. Wisdom without love and power is arrogance and cowardice. Yet, the one who has love, power, and wisdom can shape the galaxy. In this way, the father unknowingly predicted exactly how both the Sith and the Jedi would act. And unfortunately, it also predicted what would come of his children. The very same waters of the font of power and the pool of knowledge would prove too volatile to the son and the daughter. The galactic imbalance drained them of their physical strength and mental energy, causing them both to perpetually replenish themselves in their respective dark side and light side nexuses. By doing this, they escalated, intensified the differences between them, so that in time, they ceased to be representatives of power and knowledge, and instead became the avatars of the dark and the light. Because they were so affected by the broken state of the galaxy, they were never able to reconcile these differences. And soon, their animosity turned to violence. They began to fight amongst one another. Tragically, they themselves had forgotten the importance of maintaining all of the 4 precepts, as they should have done when they were pure celestials. In one of their most contentious battles, they accidentally destroyed the wellspring of balance. But despite their animosity, they truly loved one another and longed to be together. The father strived incessantly to accomplish this, but without the wellspring, he grew wary of his task, and was unable to restore the balance, even within himself. In this way did a deep loneliness set upon him, and the father began to regret having come to this plane. And that is when she arrived, a mortal woman as beautiful and as graceful as the Celestials themselves had been. The woman had no memory of her past, not even her name, recalling only that she had walked through an ancient portal and then arrived here. This was a mystery, but the father could detect no evil nor deception within her, resolving that only that an ancient gate, perhaps a damaged one, had brought her into this strange world. But the woman was not a curse to the father, she was a blessing, a distraction from the endless struggles that had beset him as well as his children. Now, taking a pause here, we thought we should go ahead and mention something. Supernatural Encounters insists that this woman is actually one of Telotni's children, a child that Telotni fashioned out of the last tiny scrap of love that she had left. Apparently, the woman was also infused with Telotni's spirit, and supposedly was essentially her backup plan, a way that kept her consciousness alive. But despite however well that fits in with the lore created by Supernatural Encounters, we again have to refer to what has already been established in Legends continuity via the Fate of the Jedi series. As we mentioned all the way back in the very beginning of this video, we have to treat Supernatural Encounters as pseudo-canonical. In the Fate of the Jedi series, we learned that this woman was just a regular human, one that somehow found her way onto the world where the ones were living, and that she was in fact mortal and not a child of Telotni. But anyway, let's continue. In time, she proved to be loyal and grew to love the ones, and soon she was invited to stay as a servant of them. The father deemed her to be the embodiment of love, for what greater servant was there than love? The only thing that was forbidden to her was the font of power and the pool of knowledge. For the father explained that they were only for him and his offspring for the sole purpose of guiding the galaxy, that she was unfit. But since she had no interest in anything but their love, she happily conceded to this one rule. Soon, the father even married her, and she was thusly known as the Mother. She was the perfect addition to their family. She doted on the father, which finally gave him peace. She helped deter the son and the daughter from fighting, developing individual relationships with both of them. She put her skills to good use, particularly with the son, whom the mother guided to using his destructive powers for construction. She had him carve alcoves into the planet where the family would have frequent picnics and meetings. The group had officially put together a synergy of the 4 precepts, with the love of the mother bonding the family, holding them together. It could have been this way forever, but the truth of mortality would be the thief of that joy. The reality is that the mother was mortal. Without immortality, she began to age, and watched as her family remained exactly the same as they were throughout her aging years. The father noticed her aging as well, and grew worried, but there was little he could do without the violation of universal law. Soon, in her new age state, she wasn't able to control the son and the daughters warring anymore. They began to disregard her as weak and to fight among themselves again. The father's despair at the prospect of losing his loving wife threw him into a deeper melancholy than ever before, and the mother was completely and totally powerless to fix it all. In a moment of sheer panic, she resolved to amend the issue by becoming like they were, even if it meant disobeying the one rule she was given. The mother then bathed in the pool of knowledge, which was said to give one wisdom from all past and all futures, and she drank from the font of power, which was said to grant one strength from past and future. However, she was not of celestial origin, but was merely human. The incredible abilities of these two potent nexuses would morph, alter, change her. With all of the knowledge of the past and the future, her mind became damaged as it fractured. And with the power of past and future, her body could not handle it. But of these energies interacting with her mindset, what she was thinking is what would truly damn her forever. What she was feeling was full of fear and desperation, causing the dark side to grow within her. She was thusly disfigured into a tentacled monstrosity. Her eyes no longer sparkled like wine in a glass, but were now inky black holes that reflected the starry abyss of deep space. No longer was her smile of love and mirth, but of a grotesque split in her face that stretched ear to ear, filled with sharp teeth. Her skin became as pale as a corpse. Her fingers, writhing tentacles reminiscent of those who had once terrorized the galaxy from the dark other space. No longer was she the loving, doting mother. She now called herself Abeloth. When she returned to the son and daughter, she exerted her new power over them, forcefully making them cease fighting and to bow before her. The father was horrified at what he saw, and he took his children, departing from the world. The ones then immediately summoned the aid of the Killiks, this time to create a prison. Using Centerpoint Station, they would drag together a cluster of black holes to create a trap that would keep Abeloth from ever escaping. This would become known as the Maw Cluster, and after this, the ones departed from a new pocket dimension, calling it Mortis, but they would ever remain vigilant, filled with grief and regret. With Abeloth, her worst fears had been brought to life with her family abandoning her, and she fully and wholly gave way to madness. But she would indeed see her family again, but not in the way she wanted. From this point forward, anytime there was a shift in the tides of the Force, Abeloth would escape her confinement within the Maw. Her mere presence would throw the galaxy into discord and war. The son and the daughter would have to battle her over the Maw and combine their powers to re-imprison her. But because of how the events occurred, the father was not able to leave Mortis to be a guide for the galaxy as he had wanted. All of his time and energy went into maintaining the balance between his warring children and keeping Abeloth at bay, and the task of keeping peace in the galaxy, justice, and order would need to fall to another. The Qua species, who had helped in building the Tho-Yor, now volunteered to go out in the father's stead, to spread the teachings of the Force, teachings of balance to as many peoples as they could, using what little remained of the Infinity Gate technology. And so, this is how it would be for many, many years. Chapter 3, A Galaxy in Development. We're going to end our usage of supernatural encounters here, since we have many official legend sources now to tell us what sorts of things happened during this age. A great period of time would pass, until we get to about the year 100,000 DBY. This was a big one for the galaxy, as a lot of things would begin to ripple and take place during this time. During this era, very few of the firstborn races remained, and among those that did, they were by and large a shadow of their former selves. The galaxy was no longer that esoterically advanced society of a primordial age. All of civilization had been hit with a reset button, and pretty much everyone was starting from the ground up. It appears that the very first rudimentary form of hyperspace travel was invented during this time. The ones responsible were the Kolumai species. The Kolumai were a race of beings that were very small, only standing a few feet tall with extremely large heads. Their natural intelligence and sophisticated brains lent to them being the first race to develop advanced technology and interstellar flight. They were the very first species to dispatch scouts to explore other corners of the galaxy, though back in this period of time, there wasn't much to discover, as all other races on each planet around them were still extremely primitive in comparison to their advanced society. What they did do, however, was visit Coruscant and the humans. At this time, the very first layer of the massive city of Coruscant would begin to reach its completion. But apparently, the Kalumai were so disappointed with the humans and the Duros that they chose to return home. The Gree, however, found Coruscant yet again, and it would be the Gree that would help the humans in the earliest skyscrapers of the city. It was around 90,000 BBY when the city began to build upwards. It isn't quite clear who exactly developed the first hyperdrive technology in this time, but many races lay claim to that feat. The absolute earliest official example we could find, though, was the Kalumai, but in the days before hyperdrives were widespread, and the hypergates and infinity gates were still closed to public use, the people of the galaxy developed other ways of exploration. The first ways of traveling were the generation ships, and later, sleeper ships. Generation ships were massive vessels in which basically a miniature civilization would grow until the ship would reach its destination. They utilized different compartments for growing food, primary and secondary power generators, living quarters, and entertainment modules. The main purpose of its design, though, was for the primary and future generations to teach their offspring how to run the ship and how to colonize worlds. The knowledge was then passed down until the destination was reached and the colony could be established. Several generations could theoretically grow up, grow old, and die within the ship before it reached where it was supposed to go. Hence the name, the generation ship. This is the way things were back in the day. This is how you had to travel across the stars and through real space. Typical speed in this day made travel between distant stars last decades or centuries even, well beyond a normal human's lifespan. The second incarnation of this idea was the sleeper ships, as the explorers setting out wanted to be the ones to discover new systems themselves. These slightly more advanced ships could reach faster than light travel via a rudimentary dimensional technology rift. But within these ships, the occupants were placed in a state of suspended animation, sometimes even through early carbon freezing, which allowed them to stay alive until they reached their destination. This is how many of the core world were able to reach others in the widespread galaxy. One of the most famous of these ancient ships was the Grey Secant. The Grey Secant was constructed by the Gree for the purpose of studying the farthest reaches of the galaxy. This vessel was automated with an artificial intelligence, and it jumped from star system to star system for centuries on end, studying each of the planets and the species that it would encounter. The ship would remain in constant motion for tens of thousands of years, only returning to the Gree sometime around the year 3639 BBY, where the ship would then become almost a religious icon to the future generations of the Gree. All would be mostly well for this period of time, around 60,000 years of peace. Around this time, both the light and the dark side of the Force would begin to swell, as many things took place simultaneously. As a prophecy foretold, the cycle of war would begin anew. In one section of the galaxy, a shadow would darken and rise. The skies would turn black, and in another, a brilliant light illuminated as a beacon. The greatest era was now upon us, as we enter the year 36,453 BBY. And with that we have reached Chapter 4, the Tho-Yor Arrival. By now, 8 of the 9 Tho-Yor had already spread out and lay dormant in various systems across the galaxy. The Qua had been dutifully teaching various peoples about the ways and how to touch into the Force, and from them, many religions had budded and were now blossoming as the age went on. The most prominent of these would be the Order of the Dai Bendu, who resided on Ando Prime. They knew the ways of the Force well, and were said to be the first race to discover the existence of midichlorians. Every year, the Dai Bendu would scale the snowy Andobai Mountains and attend the Tho-Yor, the ship that had nested itself in the mountain range. The monks knew that the Tho-Yor was not of their world, but they could perceive that it was powerful in the Force. They sensed that within the sealed structure, great mysteries were waiting to be revealed. And so the Dai Bendu would meditate at the structure to contemplate the Force and their destiny within it. Until one day, the Tho-Yor stirred and spoke. A voice imperceivable to the ear echoed through the Force itself, issuing the Dai Bendu an invitation. At this time, the door to the Tho-Yor opened and accepted all who climbed within it, and the ship rose from the mountaintop and departed Ando Prime. Elsewhere across the stars, the other 7 Tho-Yor did the same for the inhabitants of the worlds that they had landed on. The Wookiee mystics of Kashyyyk heard its call and found great peace in it. On Dathomir, the shamans and seers that predated the Night Sisters heard its call as well, in their dreams and visions. In their rituals, The Twi'leks philosophers on Ryloth often debated the source of the living energy that surrounded them, and then the Thoyor activated in their desert and called to each of them who could feel its call. They instinctively knew the answers to their questions, that they all lay within the ship. In the oceans of Manaan, the Selkath scientists paused their studies as the doors of the great Thoyor opened, offering its wisdom. The Thoyor would then travel to many other worlds on their way, picking up many species, and this would include humans, the Iktachi, the Cathar, the Zabrak, the Miraluka, the Devorians, the Krivaki, and many others, including even some Sith purebloods. Even within the purebloods, the possibility of light and balance existed within them. Once they had gathered enough of these sentients, the Thoyor ferried them all towards the center of the galaxy. Traveling through hyperspace, the Thoyor navigated the strange anomalies of the deep core to perfection until they reached their final destination. Waiting for them on the Force-wealthy planet was Tython, along with the 9th and the largest of the Thoyor vessels. The first thing they realized was that the planet was extremely sensitive to the Force, and all who arrived shared that same sensitivity. The planet itself heralded their arrival with great storms. Now that they had been brought to their new home, these people from distant cultures and worlds all came together, now calling themselves Tythons. This was known as the First Great Migration, or the Thoyor Arrival. The first galactic calendar ever used by the Tythons would actually be based on the arrival of the Thoyor, and it was abbreviated to TYA. On Tython, they quickly discerned what their purpose was, the place to study the Force, a place to attempt to master the abilities that it had given them. They didn't know why this had all occurred, but none of them questioned it, for they decided that it was their way to pay no heed to the past or to the future, but that they must remain grounded in the present, where balance in the Force was maintained. But truly to know the Force would require far more than just sitting in contemplation. They learned how to practice a sort of moving meditation, having the Force rush through them as they entered a flow state, allowing the Force to dictate their actions. Over the next 1,000 years, the Jedi built a great civilization, establishing temples, cities, and places of learning and healing, all of which centered around the various Thoyor ships that had come to settle in various places on the world of Tython. Upon observing the world around them, the Jedi saw 2 moons in the sky, light, Oshla, and dark, Bogan, which taught them the dual aspects of the Force. The light defined the dark, as the dark did the light. They began to attempt to tame the same wilds of Tython, which quickly proved itself to be a beast all of its own. The planet was so potent with the Force that if perfect balance was not maintained upon it, it would react with violent force storms and mighty earthquakes. And so the Tythons defined themselves as a people ever seeking the balance. They called themselves the Jedi, taking the 2 Daibendu words which meant mystic center. They determined that only through the harmony of balance could the Jedi maintain a peaceful world, and it seems that the Celestials chose this world as a way to teach them in a very hands-on way, showing them that imbalance would breed chaos. But it wasn't just natural disasters that provided these threats and lessons. It was Tython's fauna that contained many large and dangerous predators, those which gave the Jedi practice in both combat and reaching out to other creatures through the living force. The Jedi established 9 great temples around the Thoyor, each one with a specific field of study, and they were the following: Kaleth, the Temple of Knowledge. This one was perched over a Force Nexus. This is where the Jedi gathered as a whole when important matters arose. You had the Temple of Bodhi, which became the Temple of the Arts. It was appropriately located on the Green Plains, near a pleasant forest. This is where the students and masters of the Force used it to manifest through art, such as writing, dancing, calligraphy, drawing, sculpting, cooking, music, and even theater. The next temple is Anil Kesh, the Temple of Science. This place straddled the chasm, a gorge so deep that no one has ever found the bottom. Here is where the Jedi scientists plumbed the mysteries of Force alchemy. The next temple was Maharakesh, the Temple of Healing. This one is located in the deep ocean, with great portions of it extending underwater. The focus here, as the name suggested, is the healing arts, both with and without the Force. The next temple was Ver-Tepe, the Forge. This temple lies directly under an active volcano, and it utilizes the heat and the magma in order to provide power to the entire structure. This is where the Jedi crafted their gear, specifically their unique metal swords. Next you had the temple known as Qigong Kesh, the Temple of Force Skill. This was located in the Silent Desert. This is where many students honed their mental and their sensory abilities. Next is Stavkash, the Temple of Martial Arts. As it states, this academy, which lay in the mountains, was a place where the Jedi learned to harness their martial abilities, both in hand-to-hand combat as well as sword training. Padawan Kesh, the Jedi Academy. At this temple, this is where the very young initiates were housed and taught until they were ready to be taken in by a master. And finally, Akarkesh, the Temple of Balance. Above the towering pinnacle of Tython floats the largest of the Thoyor. It was a valued place of introspection, contemplation. Here, the balance of the light and the dark side of the Force was taught, and where balance was achieved. Those born with the ability to use the Force were always brought to Tython, as they would pass through one temple to the other, seeking knowledge and balance. But not all of those that came with them on the Thoyor. Not every child born to the Jedi was Force sensitive. As such, they were at the mercy of the strict world around them, and not even the Jedi could protect them. During one of Tython's severe lashouts, the city of Aruum was destroyed completely, and it was from this moment forward that it was made very clear Tython was too dangerous for those that could not touch the Force, and so a second great migration was to occur. All of the Tythons who were not Jedi departed the world. This was a time of great sorrow for many families, as they were all torn apart, separated from one another, but a time viewed as an even greater necessity. The people from this migration would go and settle the other worlds in the Tytho system, and over the years the Jedi intervened and settled other worlds themselves when they were requested to do so, going as only the Force directed. And as the centuries wore on, the Jedi became mysterious and even feared in the eyes of the people that had once been their family and were in the immediate vicinity of them, fearing the Jedi's great power and command over the Force. Not understanding it, they became figures of legend, wielding incomprehensible powers and masterfully wielding nigh indestructible swords imbued with the power of the Force itself. But as the light waxed in the center of the galaxy, so too in another place was darkness beginning to spread. Chapter 5: The Infinite Empire, the Rakata. Concurrently, with the Thoyor arriving in 36,453 BBY, the Qua species would use their Infinity Gate technology to discover another species, one that lay on a world known as Lehon. That species were the Rakata. Apparently either the Qua didn't know or didn't remember that the Rakata had once been they who had come from the Dark Dimension thousands of years earlier, and so the Qua taught the Rakata the ways of the Force, providing them with their advanced technology. However, the Rakata were still the power-hungry and the cannibalistic race that they had been crafted to be by Telotni. They disregarded the teachings of balance and drew exclusively from the dark side of the Force as their ancestors had taught them. They stole the Qua's technology and expanded out from Lehon, conquering many worlds in the unknown expanse of space. And as this occurred, they called themselves the Infinite Empire. Their MO was to target worlds rich in the Force, conquer them while enslaving the native population. They became masters of Force-imbued technology, creating machines which induced fear and hatred into their slaves. They would then take those slaves, put them in other machines which drew upon those dark feelings to fuel their warships and their weapons. If that sounds familiar, that's because it's similar to the C-Ruvian Techmit process, but the Rakatans did it first, so they desired the Qua's Infinity Gate technology as well, knowing it would be the key to the total galactic domination that they desired. The Qua, however, fought back against the Rakata during the Battle of Lehon, trying to hold them off so that they could destroy the Infinity Gate. Though many Qua died in this process, following the battle, the Qua destroyed or disabled most of their remaining technology, and many of the remaining gates across the galaxy, and retreated back to their homeworld of Dathomir. But despite this setback, the Rakata were not deterred, nor destroyed. Their next project was to construct their ultimate weapon, an enormous space station factory which used the power of the Force with the energy of stars to craft an endless supply of warships, as well as droids and weaponry. This was known as the Star Forge, and they positioned it over the star of Abo in the Lehon system. With this, they developed the first reliable type of hyperdrive technology as well. However, the ships with these Rakatan hyperdrives could only lock onto worlds rich in the Force and take them there. It would not work otherwise. So the expansion of the Infinite Empire began, saw them controlling many worlds scattered across the galaxy rather than a specific region of space. Besides, of course, the unknown regions which they controlled. Yet, their Force-based technology of the Rakata had profound consequence. The Starforge began feeding off of the Rakatan's aggressive tendencies and created dark-side energies that further corrupted its creators, driving the Rakata more and more mad. By the year 35,000 BBY, the Rakata had finally reached the main galaxy and began their great period of conquest. They took in the powerful slaves who showed promise in the Force, put them through rigorous trials to become what they called Force Hounds. Force Hounds were servants that could locate planets sufficiently powerful in the Force for the Empire to conquer. These highly trained individuals were given the very first lightsaber technology by the Rakata, weapons at the time known as Force Sabers. They were simply a cylindrical hilt with no buttons nor switches. Like all of the foul Rakatan technology, a Force Saber had to be activated through the use of solely the dark side. Only then would the fiery blade ignite. One of the first worlds captured by the Rakata was Kashyyyk. While there, the Rakata decided to place one of their star maps which led directly to the Starforge, and installed a newly created terraforming computer that would begin to manipulate the planet's trees. However, after the computer lost contact with the Rakata in the year 33,598 BBY, it malfunctioned and caused the hyperacceleration in the growth of the trees. This made them grow to abnormal sizes and to dominate the forests of Kashyyyk. This turned out extremely well, since the Wookiees decided to make their homes and their villages within these new large trees. These giant trees ended up becoming the cradle of Wookiee civilization, and by 30,000 BBY, the Rakata had control of over 50 Force-rich worlds. Not all was well, as they had officially created their infinite empire, continuing to expand since no civilization in the galaxy came close to their level of technological advancement, as well as Force-based weaponry. This is actually a great place and time to pop back over to Korriban and see what the Sith are up to. In 28,000 BBY, the reign of the Axe had just begun. Our favorite Sith King had been born and risen to power. His name was King Adis. From birth, he was set apart from the others of his species by being far larger and extraordinarily strong. To complete his appearance, unlike those who were born with red skin, Adis was born with pitch black skin. His connection to the dark side more potent than any of those who had come before. And because of all of this, Adis was considered a chosen one in pure-blooded culture. Adis grew to not only be extremely intelligent and adept at combat, but he also became quite skilled with Sith magic. For his knowledge, he forged a suit of spiked armor and a helmet colored charcoal black to match his unusual skin tone. This way, all would know who he was, even when he was covered head to foot in armor. Adis armed himself with the sacred axe of his people. Back in this day, the purebloods had already figured out how to alchemically alter metal to imbue it with the dark side. These axes were absolutely massive and were extremely heavy. Even the strongest of the Massassi class, which was the most physically gifted caste of the Sith people, could only ever lift one axe at a time. But Adis wielded two of them, one in each hand, and with them, he entered a series of incredibly bloody conflicts. By 28,000 BBY, King Adis had finished his campaign and had consolidated all of the tribes of his homeworld, uniting them under his own banner. Thus began a period of time known as the Reign of the Axe, possibly one of the most important periods in all of Sith history. Much like the Dark Lords that preceded him, no one dared backstab Adis. All who tried would fail miserably. Even in this war-torn race, all of those who challenged him for his throne would be cut down by his axe in formal combat, and in their honor, he would drink their blood soup, starting a tradition which would be passed down in the Sith Order for millennia. He grew so powerful that the Sith people began to worship him as a god. The Kasai priests referred to him as the Sith Ari, a word that roughly translated to overlord, signifying that he was their perfect being. And he would also be the one that caused the Rakata to make one of their biggest mistakes. The first big failure of the Infinite Empire was when they decided to tangle with the Sith. in 27,700 BBY, they scouted out Korriban and took notice of Adis's incredible power and mastery of the dark side. Rather than go about conquest as usual, the Rakata decided to try something craftier. They attempted to buy his favor, to get him to drop his guard by appearing to the Sith as peacefully and calm as possible, imparting them with gifts in the form of holocron technology. But Adis sensed their deception and waged war against them. Unlike the other worlds they had conquered, Korriban was more than familiar with the ways of the dark side and deception. While not as technologically advanced, they knew their way around sorcery, and their warriors were sharpened to perfection. The Rakata landed in the fields of Korriban in their ships, only to be met with the armies of the Sith, shouting their God King's name in ritualistic chants. The terrifying image would be the last thing the army of the Infinite Empire would see, as the warriors of the Sith savagely defended their home. The battle was vicious, and the Rakata would learn the meaning of the Reign of the Axe. Adis personally hacked down dozens of Rakatan warriors. Even in his advanced age, he still had no equal. Despite this though, Raspir, Adis's court magician, was captured by the Rakata and put into their mind prison. In revenge for taking his jester, Adis captured many of the enemy's ships and turned them against the Infinite Empire. From the slaughter, it seems that he also claimed a red-bladed force saber for himself. King Adis would not only drive the Rakata off of Korriban, but would continue to chase them through the worlds of Ziost, Malachor V, and Tund, forcing them on a full-scale retreat out of Sith space. Adis, however, would shortly thereafter die following his victory over the Infinite Empire, apparently succumbing to the many injuries he sustained in the bloody war for his people's freedom. For the first time, the Rakatans had to go back and lick their wounds to find prizes elsewhere. Still desiring the Infinity Gate technology, they turned their sights back on the Kwa. The Kwa and the Gree were actually embroiled in a dispute of their own during this time. Old wounds had still not been mended between the two races concerning the Hypergates and the Infinity Gates, and the Gree believed that the Kwa's technology was an abomination, and they wanted to destroy it for good, since they had to do the same to their own Hypergates themselves so long ago. The Kwa believed that the technology should be obliterated. This caused a war between the two races which lasted for nearly 1,000 years, until 27,000 BBY. In this year, they were forced to stop fighting when the Rakata invaded Dathomir, the home planet of the Kwa. They also fought the Gree, beating them all the way back to their enclave. The Infinite Empire then took control of Dathomir, oppressing the Kwa so severely that they ended up devolving into the simple-minded lizard race known as the Qui. Because of all of this fighting and a surge in the dark side, the Killik legends say that Abeloth was able to now escape her confinement around this era. This is what contributed to the uproar and conflict during this age. But as always, the son and the daughter of Mortis were there to put her back in her cage. Sometime later, the Infinite Empire would again meet its match in the form of an eldritch being known as the World Raiser. We know very little about this creature, and no one has ever seen it besides the Rakata themselves, but it is likely another remnant from the Old War of the Cosmic Era. According to the ancient Rakatan inscriptions, it was claimed that the creature had the power to devour entire worlds if it desired. Only the combined might of the entire Infinite Empire was able to defeat this being, to trap it within a prison on the world of Belsavis. It is said that they made this prison specifically for this creature, but would continue to use it to trap other enemies and dissidents. The ancient cryptic inscriptions written on the inside of the prison warn of the danger of the World Raiser, and how it led to the Esha species to nearly conquer half of the galaxy. The Eshka were a rival race to the Rakata, similarly vicious people that wanted to build an empire of their own. The race's culture resembled that of a hive society, though each individual retained their own thoughts and aspirations, yet all being bred for a specific role that they were eager to fulfill. According to the writings, the Eshka were once considered one of the most feared species in the galaxy. They are said to have arisen from an unknown world, whereupon they began to cut a path of destruction across countless systems. These campaigns saw entire races being hunted to extinction. Apparently they ran around with the Rakata once they began to attack the enslaved worlds of the Infinite Empire, and the two vicious races went to a larger scale war. The Rakata absolutely hated them, and wrote about the Eshka as if they were a plague. They would then wage a war that would engulf the galaxy for a short period of time, until the Eshka were nearly wiped out. What remained of them was imprisoned for the rest of time with the World Razor. But the villainy of the Rakata would not last for so long after this. Very soon the Infinite Empire would step on the wrong toes for a final time, leading to the total collapse of their society. And so we now have reached Chapter 6, The Rise of the Jedi. Back in the Deep Core, the year is 25,805 BBY, and the Jedi Order have been thrown into their very first galactic-scale conflict, which was known as the Despot War. Queen Hadia, of a neighboring world of Shikawa, united the crime barons under a single rule. She rejected the notion of being under the will of the Force, and was ready to become the sole ruler of her planet, and then spread her influence and rule to the entire Tythos system. The Jedi saw her plans as a threat to the system's stability, and so, for the first time, they chose to intervene. A war was fought between the Jedi and the Despot army, and when Queen Hadia invaded Tython, she was defeated and killed at the Temple of Kaleth by a Jedi Ranger. The Ranger's name was Dagan Locke. Unfortunately, sometime after this, Dagan was lost to the dark side after having visions. Seeing the coming of an army wielding swords of fire, Dagan Locke insisted that the Jedi army themselves had to rally together a military, but this idea was viewed as heretical, against their peacekeeping nature, and so Dagan Locke was banished to the moon of Bogan to correct his vision. 12 years later though, his vision would come to pass when one of the Rakatan Force Hounds, going by the name of Zesh, crash landed on Tython. One of the leaders of the Infinite Empire, known as Predor Skalnas, wanted to possess the world of Tython, as he believed that there lie one of the last Infinity Gates. During this time, he had captured another tropical paradise known as Tatooine, before hearing tell of a potent planet of Tython. After conquering the planets of Obri and Mar, the Rakatan Predor greedily invaded Tython, but was met with fierce resistance from the Jedi. Forced to fall back, the Empire established their main base of operation on the world of Skagora. There, they lay at the fringe of the Tythos system, waiting. By this time though, the Force Hound Zesh had turned on the Rakata, as he allied himself with the Jedi. The Order then realized that their metal swords were not going to be enough to fight back the advanced weaponry of the Rakata, so they would mass-produce replicas of Zesh's Force Saber, even though it required them to tip their balance into the dark side in order to activate the weapon. But because of Dagan Locke's vision now being fulfilled during this time, the Jedi begrudgingly enlisted his service to lead them into war against the Rakata. The Jedi Order also allied with the armies of other worlds in the Tythos system to attack the Empire. Master Rajavari was placed in command of one of the joint forces, as he was a powerful member of the Order, and he spearheaded a daring assault on Skagora directly, striking at the heart of the Rakata within their space. Ultimately though, the Jedi came out as the victors, sending the Infinite Empire running while freeing a large degree of slaves in the process. Unfortunately though, the victory was sullied by the ensuing Force Wars, which was the first time that the Jedi Order would fight itself. Now the Jedi, while the Rakatan threat was diminished, a schism grew within the Order between that of Dagan Locke's followers and that of the Jedi Council. Eventually, the two groups were defined by an ideological difference and a divide between the use of the light and the dark side. The Dark wanted to use the Force to achieve knowledge and use the dark side to gain power, but both sides utilized the traditional metal swords of the Jedi, and they threw the Force Sabers away during this era, both sides believing them to be corruptive. Still though, some of the followers of the dark side Bogan retained the dark weapon in secret. The war was eventually fought, and Dagan Locke would be defeated. After this event, the Jedi that had followed the light side were forced to reorganize the Order into the Holy Order of the Jedi Knights, under the leadership of a High Council, believing that the light side was the safest, the most peaceful way to pursue the Force. Master Rajavari though rejected this, and started his own schism after falling to the dark side himself, beginning yet another war. This war was concluded in 25,783 BBY, but there was another problem. Tython had been thrown into such imbalance that a natural cataclysm caused a near devastation of the surface of the world, rendering the planet temporarily uninhabitable. The Jedi would be forced to leave their homeworld and travel along the Rim, searching for a new place to call home. Meanwhile, the Infinite Empire was crumbling. Over the next 583 years, a strange mutation occurred and introduced itself into the Rakatan bloodline, causing their species to gradually lose their ability to touch the Force. This spread as a deadly plague, affecting all members of the Empire. It was even theorized that the Rakatans themselves had made this weapon that had turned on them. This plague killed billions, and those that didn't die were completely severed from the Force itself. This in turn caused an internal conflict between the Rakatan overlords, who all started scrounging for what little power was left in the panic. A civil war kicked off within the Rakata species, which would further weaken their hold. Sensing the weakness in the Rakatan rulers though, all of the slave species of the Empire revolted en masse. The world of Lehon fell in the Civil War, and the Rakatans were left unable to use the Starforge, as the Force fled from them entirely. Since the worlds of the Empire were so spread out also, due to the very nature of their Force-based hyperdrive systems, the Rakata could not send aid to the people that needed them, that were fighting on the slave systems to hold the slaves back that were revolting. And soon, the galaxy threw off the shackles of the oppressors of the Infinite Empire, and the Empire dissolved entirely. It was a mostly victorious day, but during one rebellion, a tragedy struck. The lush world of Tatooine did not get off so lucky. Once they were thrown off by the overlords, the Rakata spitefully ordered an orbital bombardment of the beautiful world. And while the native Kumonga people were able to hide underground, the entire surface of Tatooine was glassed, and the ozone layer burnt to a crisp. This turned the once tropical paradise into an arid climate. All the glass on the surface melted into oceans of sand. The Kumonga would split off into two species, now the nomadic Tusken Raiders, or the devolved Jawa. In the wake of their retreat though, the Rakata left behind their technology in all of the slave worlds. The humans and the Wookiees were some of the first beings to reverse engineer the hyperdrives and achieve hyperspace travel, and the rest of the galaxy would follow. Duro and Corellia were the two planets to officially send out ships equipped with hyperdrive technology to explore the vast expanse of space. And soon, hyperspace beacons would be established in the well-traveled routes in order to keep them open at all times. Back in this day, hyperspace technology required a beacon at the destination of jump to reliably navigate, since navicomputers and droids didn't yet have the processing power to do the calculations themselves. Back in this time, hyperspace explorers would chart hyperlanes by making carefully calculated micro-jumps, plotting it along the way. When safe and useful lanes were discovered, space stations would be dispatched to serve the same purpose as lighthouses do. Beacons that would keep the lanes open serve as a connection point to send hyperspace jump coordinates to navicomputers attempting to use the lane. And with this would begin the start of a brand new civilization. Chapter 7: The Hutts and Zim the Despot. Before the Hutts became the gangsters and crime lords that we know them as, they were actually a race of physically powerful warriors. Since the Empyrean Wars, they had been mostly stuck on the world of Varl, embroiled in their own wars until the Infinite Empire arrived. When they received hyperspace travel, they left their world to seek destinies among the stars though, and whenever they encountered a species strong enough to resist them, they would utterly destroy them. When they encountered a species too weak to be use of them, it was the same fate. Only those species that were purely useful to the Hutt ambitions were allowed to become slaves and survive. Even many of them were then worked to near extinction. Unlike the empires of before, the Hutts generally seemed to regard political or military conflict of less importance and focused more on commerce. For the first time, the galaxy got a breath of fresh air with a group of old-fashioned tyrants, those who were in it for the money and the wealth. This meant that they could, at the very least, be reasoned with, especially if one had a good amount of riches. The Hutts had always utilized a grab bag of technologies that were copied, borrowed, or stolen from other races. And because of this, little is known about their own native technology, assuming they even had any to begin with. The best of the ancient Hutts, though, and their records were kept by the Sakaians, one of the very few species in Hutt space to maintain their independence and to beat the Hutts back and win their respect. Sakaian chronicles tell of Hutt warriors clad in iron shells, moving via clattered metal limbs, using tread or wheels to move quickly. They essentially made up for the lack of mobility by using technology to turn them into living tanks. The Hutts were very durable, they could take a ton of hits and damage, and were extremely naturally strong. It is said that even the mucus produced on the Hutt's skin makes them extra difficult to kill with bladed weapons. But the ancient Sakaians also apparently helped the Hutts construct weapons known as plain Jengas, which were massive railguns, guns used to accelerate space rocks into planet-busting velocities. Many other records speak of the horror of the ancient Hutts wrought upon their section of space, with accounts recording worlds who somehow befriended the Hutts before, and the Hutts responding by depopulating the world, poisoning it, bombarding it, or even incinerating planets. But what would launch the Hutts into even greater infamy throughout the galaxy would be what would happen when they ran into a very specific warlord. If you're studying literally anything about the pre-Republic era of the galaxy, you would be hard-pressed to make it very far without stumbling across the name of Zim. His reputation has endured for 25 millennia following his death. Depending on who you ask, Zim is a romantic swashbuckler, a sad symbol of lost power and prestige, the embodiment of human brutality, or an icon of madness and ruin. Even scholars are divided about what this ruler who emerged from the Taion cluster was actually about, arguing about which of his deeds should be attributed to his father Zair, and how many of these stories were simply made up by the Despostica people, and were not based in reality at all. It's generally accepted though that Zim was born of the son of a pirate king by the name of Zair on the planet of Argai. Zair and his pirates see ships moving between hyperspace beacons, operating in the Indrexu Spiral, which was a nebula in the Taion cluster located in the Outer Rim. The pirates' wealth and exploits attracted the attention of many of the raiders to Zair's banner, and the Pirate King would dominate his competition on the world of Pana. He would go to war and would absolutely shatter the fleet of the Kingdom of Kron, making himself King Zair their new king as well. At the time, Zim was only a teenager, but he would make his appearance soon after, becoming famous for his brutality during the slaughter of Kron's nobility. After Zair retired, Zim fulfilled his father's ambitions and smashed through many of his enemies that had eluded Zair during his own reign. Zim entered an expansion period, where for the next 10 years he went on a crusade that saw all of the worlds that opposed the Taionese destroyed and absorbed into Zim's empire. Part of what attributed to Zim's and the Despot's success was that he was one of the very first to use an army of battle droids. At this time during the war, his war droids were technological marvels which had been derived from the Rakata design. He also was the first to have widespread use of archaic blaster technology, which was at this point in time called beam tubes. By the end of the expansionist period though, Zim ruled a vast domain which included hundreds of thousands of planets, all linked together by a network of hyperspace beacons. Adventurous Taionese scouts and merchants explored beyond this network, hoping to win Zim's favor by discovering rich new planets. But some returned describing meetings with alien traders who served ruthless slug-like creatures and overlords. From this point forward, the Hutts became Zim's obsession. He burned with the desire to add the Hutt trade worlds to his empire, to grow his wealth beyond belief, and all the more. And so he prepared for war, taking the old Rakatan title, Daretha, a word that meant overlord. In the 25th year of Zim's reign, he assaulted the Hutt worlds and sacked Kovari, but the Hutts would not be so easily defeated. The current lord of the Hutts, Kosak, was a crafty enemy. He lured Zim into a ritual combat on the world of Vontor. The despot would fight 3 battles there, all of which he would lose. At the first battle, which took place in 25,100 BBY, his warships were bested in space. In the second battle, his army was defeated by the heavy infantry that the Hutts had enlisted from their own conquered worlds. Zim was then given the choice for a third battle to be fought on either ground or space. He chose the ground, and at the third battle of Vontor, he and his soldiers and war droids were overwhelmed by Nikto, as well as Vodran and Klatunian berserkers, led by Bunta the Hutt. So obsessed was Zim with Hutt space and their culture that he ignored his advisors and bled his empire dry, creating warships and battle droids. Vontor the Hutt simply showed the depth of his foolishness, as he had been lured into fighting a war from his own borders and therefore far from his supplies. Zim was not just defeated, he was captured and paraded around in chains throughout all of Hutt space. All of his orbital space stations were taken as trophies for the Hutts, and it was said that Bunta Eve Pod Race was named so in Bunta the Hutt's honor, as he had once organized foot races to be run by prisoners while the Hutts wagered on them. The world of Kovari was also to be renamed as Bunta once it was recaptured from Zim, but as the war was laid to rest, Zim's empire dissolved into something else, happening much closer to the core. And now we reach the finale, the birth of the Republic. The year is 25,053 BBY. The Jedi had finally come to rest on the world of Ossus. Everyone was now scrambling around to figure out the new superpower of the galaxy and the status quo. This began an era of time known as the Unification Wars. Very little is actually explained about what exactly goes on here during the war, and what happened politically during this day and era. It's all somewhat of a deep mystery. No one really knows what pushed the war forward. What did happen though was a warlord emerged by the name of Zack Renand, and he is generally painted as the villain of this conflict. We know that the Jedi Order took part in this war and fought against him as they deemed him to be evil and worthy of their destruction. Following these wars, several planets from the core world such as Coruscant, Corellia, Alderaan, and Duro all came together to form what we know as the Galactic Republic. In this year, all the founders signed a galactic constitution, officially putting the galaxy into the modern age. And with that, we will be ending today's gigantic holocron. From the moment of the Star Wars universe's creation to the establishment of the Republic, I want to give a massive sincere thank you to all of you who have watched all the way to the end. We thought the Origin of the Sith video was ambitious, but with this one we wanted to take things even further. It would never have been possible without you guys constantly supporting, watching, commenting, and just being all around phenomenal. We are very excited to bring these concepts to your attention, and your responsiveness always encourages us to find even crazier things to write about and explore in the Star Wars mythos. So from both myself and all who work in the archives, thank you so much. We know that the majority of this holocron is written out of the annals of supernatural encounters, which may be controversial for some. We here even have mixed feelings about the books and the concepts that it introduces to Star Wars lore. We definitely encourage you to provide your own thoughts about it, and whether or not you view it as a part of Star Wars Legends continuity or the expanded universe or not. But we can say that it was absolutely incredible to see the beginnings of the universe and what the ancient galaxy looked like, even if this is one of the only lens available. The story was really strange and really interesting. I think above all though, Supernatural Encounters does a good job of taking all of these scattered concepts in the esoteric parts of Star Wars lore and linking them all together, making it a sort of through line for those that want to get very deep into Star Wars lore. And if you guys want to see more parts of the book in other videos, please let us know. And as an end note, this video was written prior to the full release of the 3rd edition of Supernatural Encounters, as that is going to expand even more on the lore of the ancient galaxy. So if there are any disputes between this script and the updated version of the book, that might be why. But anyway, my friends, as our vision darkens from the view of the primordial past, and as the ruins crumble to dust, there is but one more thing to say. Thank you for joining us today, and may the Force be with you.